I've been a watch lookout for about a year now. I spend most of my life alone in a small, window-lined, one-room shack atop a steel and wood-frame tower in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My only companions are my collection of cheap novels, a laptop computer with infrequent and unreliable internet service, and the two-way radio I use to communicate with the few other nearby towers and ranger stations. Nearby is a bit of a misnomer, though. Using my high-powered binoculars, I can just barely make out Tower 12 on a clear day, situated several miles to my west. Tower 15, the next nearest to my location, only appears as a glint of sunlight to my east when the sun catches it just right. I've been told the Parks Department intends to put up some additional towers in this area as soon as it gets the necessary funding, which is probably no time soon. That's fine with me, though. I like the solitude. It helps quiet my mind, keeps the memories at bay. I occupy most of my days either with simple maintenance in and around the tower, or scanning the dense sea of trees all around me for any signs of trouble. It's been a dry year, so the threat of fire is a constant one. This particular afternoon, I was clearing some brush from around the base of the tower that had begun to encroach on the fire road leading from my tower back to the main ranger station, 20 miles away. Even with the heavy suspension of the government-issued Jeep parked nearby, that was a harsh ride in the best of times. I had just finished dragging some brush cuttings off into the tree line when the radio clipped to my belt squawked. Tower 9, this is Tower 12. How copy? It was Billy Johnson, my supervisor. Nice enough guy, I suppose. Tended to leave me alone most of the time. I straightened up and stretched my back, wiping the sweat out of my eyes with my forearm, and keyed the microphone attached at my shoulder. Go for Tower 9. I replied as I replaced the shears and bow saw in the small storage shed near the base of the stairs. John, do you have eyes on a bit of smoke north of your position? Stand by, Bill. Really? I said, snatching up my water bottle and jogging up the metal staircase that wrapped its way around my tower. I didn't bother locking the 8-foot chain link fence that surrounded my little compound. Chances were I'd be back down here soon enough. Reaching the top, I stepped through the trapdoor and onto the walkway that surrounded the cabin, closing it behind me. It was habit at this point. The last thing I needed was to take a misstep and tumble down through the open trapdoor. I'd probably end up breaking my neck. As I passed by, I reached into the open door of the shack and grabbed the binoculars hanging on a nearby hook. Rounding the railed corner of the walkway and turning my attention to the dark green blanket of trees stretching out before me, I saw the smoke almost immediately. A thin trickle of wispy white haze rose lazily above the canopy some distance off. Probably just some campers, I figured, though there weren't any approved campsites in that area. We always had more than a few folks every season who decided that camping off-trail in the deep bush sounded like a hoot. Most of them come back just fine, oblivious to the danger this wilderness poses to anyone not adequately prepared. Some have to be brought out by search and rescue. Some of them just don't come back. A ranger, or maybe even a random hiker, will occasionally trip across the deserted remains of a campsite and report it in. Those are the spooky ones, the ones where the people have just vanished and left behind a perfectly set up camp. No explanation, no clues, just a deserted clearing, often with perfectly intact tents and personal effects. But there are bears and mountain lions, along with a handful of lesser predators that roam these forests, and sometimes they get hungry enough to stalk and even get humans. And that doesn't even take into consideration the much more likely probability that folks step out of their tents at night to take a leak in the woods and quickly get lost, unable to find their way back to camp. Most humans aren't suited to survival in the wilderness, unfortunately. My radio squawked again. Tower 9, what's the word? Yeah, I see it, man. Looks to be a couple miles due north of my tower. What's your plan? He asked. I knew what he was really asking. Keep an eye on it and hope for the best, or take a trip over and investigate. After a brief moment's pause, I sighed with resignation. It's probably just a campfire, but I guess I'd better head on over and take a look, just to be sure. I didn't relish the thought of a trek into that area of wilderness, to be honest. It was the only area I hadn't explored during my time here. There weren't many trails headed in that direction, and the ones that did were badly overgrown and too narrow for the Jeep. A couple miles hike might not seem like a lot, but when you're out here alone, the dense trees seem to stretch on forever. 2 miles can seem like 100. Roger that, John, Billy replied. Take your pack and your rifle and check in periodically. Will do. Tower 9 out, I said, replacing the binoculars on their hook and shouldering the red canvas backpack, waiting dutifully in the corner chair. I grabbed the rifle from its rack over the doorframe, checked to make sure it was loaded, and headed out. As I locked the gate behind me, I threw my pack into the back of the Jeep and set the rifle beside it. The Jeep wouldn't get me far before the brush made the trail impassable, but if it saved me even half a mile of hiking, it was worth it. The sun was still high in the sky. I had plenty of time to get there and back before dusk, as long as I didn't dawdle. I started the engine and put the Jeep into gear, turning the wheels toward the unmaintained trail to my right. After only a few moments, the trees and canopy obscured any trace of the watchtower behind me. I was actually able to push the Jeep farther than I'd expected, a pleasant surprise. I was probably a mile along the trail before it crapped the bed. A massive pine lay across the path, much too large to go over. The dense underbrush around me precluded going around, and I immediately lamented not bringing the chainsaw. Cutting it up and winching the pieces out of the way wouldn't have been too difficult and would have saved me a ton of trouble. With a quiet curse, I stepped out of the Jeep and grabbed my gear from the back seat. I smiled to myself as a quote from a certain fictional adventure-seeking archaeologist came to mind. We walk from here. Marking the Jeep's location on my handheld GPS so I could find it again, I stepped over the thigh-high tree trunk and continued along the path. According to my earlier estimate, the trail I was walking seemed to head in the direction of the smoke, which was a blessing in my book. The less time I had to spend bushwhacking, the better. The trail narrowed as I expected, and before too long I was brushing branches and leaves with my shoulders. The forest, which had been alive with the chittering and chirping of animal life back at the tower, now seemed muted. The forest around me was growing denser, feeling oddly claustrophobic at times. I checked in with Billy a couple of times, advising him of my progress and promising to maintain periodic checks. He advised me that a weather front had rolled in from the ranger station, indicating an approaching storm that would likely reach us before nightfall. A quick check of my watch made me wince. I had already spent more time than I had predicted it would take to reach the suspected campsite. Maybe it was best to turn around and head back. The last thing I wanted was to get caught out here overnight with minimal supplies and in a rainstorm. I wasn't worried, but it sure wouldn't make for a comfortable night. If I had been farther from my destination, I probably would have turned back right then. I wish I had. Within another 20 minutes, however, I smelled the faint scent of a wood fire. Not strong, but it was there. I was even more certain of what I would find when I reached them. When I stepped out of the now almost non-existent trail and found myself in a sparsely treed area amidst a dozen or so wooden shacks, I halted in surprise. I had reached the base of a hilly rise covered in heavy forestry, and these old, forgotten cabins looked like they had been part of some sort of small settlement, perhaps an old logging camp, I thought to myself. I didn't know this place even existed and made a mental note to research it when I got back to my tower. I keyed the microphone. Tower 12, this is John. Do you copy? When Billy replied, his voice was staticky and distant. Hey John, Tower 12, what's your status? I frowned and looked around at the towering trees. I supposed I was asking more out of the portable radio than was reasonable. I was lucky I still had any signal at all, to be honest. I found what looks like an old logging or trapping camp, I said, meandering among the decaying and derelict cabins. Most of them had decayed to the point of collapse, and there weren't any with intact roofs. The campfire has to be nearby. I'm going to take a look around a bit more. There was an odd pause before Billy spoke again. What's your current location, John? I glanced at my handheld GPS and relayed my position to him. Another pause. John, I think you should probably just turn around and come back. You don't have too many more hours of daylight left, and that storm looks to be getting worse. Something in his voice sounded off, but I couldn't quite place it. Nervous, maybe? I don't think I could blame him, though. My safety was his responsibility, and the prospect of one of his lookouts being caught out in the storm overnight probably didn't sit well with him. Coincidentally, it didn't sit well with me either, I thought with a smile. You may be right, Billy, I replied, turning around and letting my eyes take in the entirety of the area. I think I'll just go. I stopped as my eyes caught sight of the bright yellow nylon tent just beyond the last of the structures. Repeat your last, said Billy. I didn't get that. Stand by Tower 12, I said absently, making my way to what I now realized was a small cluster of 3 modern tents situated around a central fire ring. The fire had been extinguished, but the embers still smoldered lowly, the source of the smoke. I looked around for the campers, but didn't see or hear anyone. Sleeping bags and electric lanterns were still in the tents, though I couldn't find any backpacks or supplies. Hello? I called out, turning in a circle and trying to pick out any signs or sounds of human life. I'm with the Forest Service. Is anyone there? Nothing but the muted echo of my own voice. I was about to just dump some dirt on the remaining embers of the campfire and call it a day when I noticed the narrow footpath heading toward the slope. I could clearly see the recent footprints in the soft dirt heading away from the camp. I keyed the microphone at my shoulder again. Tower 12, this is John. I found the source of the smoke. It's a campfire, all right? Nothing to be concerned about, Billy answered almost immediately. Roger that, John. Head back home. I paused a moment, curiosity pulling me toward the footpath. I'll be heading back shortly, Billy. I just want to check something out first. I wouldn't screw around out there, John, Billy replied, an edge to his voice. Better head back now so you can beat the storm. His last sentence didn't exactly sound like a suggestion. Something had him rattled. I hesitated before I answered. Acknowledged. Knowing full well that I was going to check out the path a bit before heading back. Still, I didn't feel like arguing with my supervisor about something silly. Just a quick walk up that path, and then I'd be on my way. This path was even less established than the one I'd been on when I discovered the camp. But I could clearly see the prints of the campers in the soft dirt. Before long, I emerged into a small clearing, eyes widening with yet another unexpected discovery. The rough-hewn timber that framed the entryway was set into the near-vertical slope of the hillside before me. It created a dark tunnel entrance that had been sealed off with a heavy iron gate many years before, likely by the Park Service to keep inquisitive hikers from falling to their ends in an old abandoned mine shaft. So, it had been a mining camp, not a logging camp. I didn't know there were any mines anywhere near here. Hell, I'm not sure what they would have been mining for. Coal. Maybe? Did they even have gold mines in Tennessee? Who knows? Certainly not me, clearly. Regardless, now that gate stood wide open on its hinges, the remains of a rusted chain and antique padlock lying in the dirt nearby. Yeah, hell no, I couldn't just turn around and leave. Not if these idiot campers had decided it would be fun to explore a closed and restricted mine entrance. Tower 12, this is John. Do you copy? Billy probably wouldn't be happy that I had continued my exploration after he told me to head back, but there was nothing to do about it now. I wasn't equipped or trained for any sort of cave exploration or rescue. Rangers had very specialized teams for that sort of thing, but I could at least poke my head inside and see if I could hear the campers, or at least confirm that they actually went inside. No answer from the radio. I tried again with the same results. Nothing. I tried a different approach. Tower 15, this is John from Tower 12. Do you copy? There was a burst of static that sounded like it might have contained the hint of a human voice, but it was too distorted and distant to make anything out. There was only a moment of indecision before I made up my mind. I knew it was reckless to go into the mine, especially when my supervisor believed I was currently on my way back to my tower. But I just had this nagging intuition that something might be wrong with this whole situation. Maybe someone was hurt and in need of help. I couldn't just leave them there, knowing I might be their only chance of rescue. In retrospect, I should have turned back and called it in to the ranger station. They could have mobilized the search and rescue teams that specialize in cave rescues. I should have. But I didn't. I pulled my flashlight from my pack, turned it on, and headed into the pitch-black darkness of the mine entrance. The walls and floor had been smoothly carved many years ago, which made my footing uneventful, and the tunnel itself was mostly a straight shot. Several times during the first few minutes, I turned back to watch the bright square of daylight at the entrance gradually shrink to a pinpoint of light. By the time I had taken the first dogleg turn of the tunnel, I was in complete darkness. It was a very strange feeling, oppressive almost. At one point, I turned off my flashlight experimentally, but after only a few seconds, I quickly flicked it back on. In that time, my heart had been pounding in my chest, and some primal fear had begun growing inside of me. I took a moment to calm myself. The darkness was absolute. It was almost as if you could feel it pressing in on you. My footsteps seemed much louder than they should have on the dirt floor, and the air was beginning to grow cold and damp the farther I went. After another 100 feet or so, the smoothly carved tunnel ended abruptly in a wall of rubble. I couldn't tell if it was a cave-in at some point, or if this was simply where the miners had stopped digging and hadn't bothered to remove the debris. But either way, it certainly appeared to be the end of the line. And then I saw it. I almost missed it because of the way the light and shadows played over the head-sized rocks strewn before me. But when I looked closer, I realized I was looking at a ragged hole in the wall. It was only 5 feet across or so, and definitely didn't look like the deliberate formation of the tunnel I was standing in. It almost looked like the miners had broken into a natural void of some sort. Interesting. But there was no way in hell I was going in there. I was definitely not trained or outfitted for any sort of spelunking trip, and it didn't seem the sort of thing suited to the learn-as-you-go method. Just as I was turning back to make my way out of the mine, I heard the distant sound of voices echoing from the opening in the stone wall. The sound was faint and may have just been my imagination, but I didn't think so. "Hello?" I called, pressing my face into the black abyss of the hole. "Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." Nothing. The air from beyond the breach was cold and smelled stale, old ground. I felt as if I didn't belong here. None of us did. There was a long moment of unbroken silence. And then I heard a voice again, closer this time. "Did you hear that?" it said, presumably to a companion. It sounded like a young woman, nervous, uncertain. "Hello? Is someone in there?" That settled it for me. I carefully crawled through the opening and into the space beyond. Shining my light around, I found myself in a small natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with an uneven ceiling of jagged rock that barely cleared my head. The first thing that caught my attention was the cracked lantern lying on the ground. It looked old, very old, maybe 100 years or more. A thick layer of grime and age covered its soot-blackened tin surface, and the glass was thick and uneven. Beside the askew lantern was a small leather-bound book, partially buried in the dirt and dust, with a moldering leather strap securing it closed. It looked like a journal, and without a thought, I tucked it into my backpack. Raising my light to scan the room again, I called out, "Hello?" I couldn't hear the voices anymore, but the narrow beam of my flashlight illuminated another tunnel in the far corner of the room, mired in darkness. "Can you hear me?" I shouted. Once again, I got that feeling that something wasn't right. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in there?" she asked. Her voice trembling with apprehension. I hesitated, frowning. Something didn't seem right about the voice, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could respond, another voice called out. This time, it was clearly the voice of a young man. "We can hear you moving around in there. Please help us. We're lost, and our friend is hurt." I was shouting to them. I sure as hell wasn't trying to hide. Could they not hear me for some reason? I stepped forward to the secondary tunnel and raised my voice again. "I'm with the Forest Service. Can you follow my voice?" It was then, when I reached out to steady myself against the wall of the tunnel entrance, that my hand met something wet. I recoiled in disgust, thinking I'd just grabbed a handful of some subterranean slime. When I put my light on it, however, the reality became very clear, and far worse. Blood. I stepped back, trying to keep the panic that was fighting to take control of my rationality at bay. I needed to keep a level head. Panning my light around, I saw an astonishing amount of red liquid painting the wall and floor in front of me. Somebody had definitely been hurt, and badly. With loss like this, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stabilize them long enough to get rescue in here. What the hell happened here? And why did the hikers continue into the cave after one of them was injured this badly? Unless they'd lost their light and gotten turned around, there was no way for them to get lost. There hadn't been any branches to this tunnel since I first entered. All they had to do was turn around and walk until they saw daylight. The man's voice called again, now colored with the unmistakable tinge of fear. "What is that? Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand." He seemed to be getting closer. At least if I could guide them to my voice, maybe I could get them out of here, get to higher ground, and radio for a rescue evacuation. They had a helicopter permanently stationed at the main ranger station. It could be here in 20 minutes if I was able to reach them. The woman's voice came again, and this time I froze. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in there?" All at once, it hit me, and the indescribable unease I had been mostly successful in repressing now fought back with renewed vigor. I realized what I had missed before. The woman had repeated herself twice more. No change in inflection, no variation in emotion or urgency. It was exactly the same, down to the syllable. It was like I was listening to a recording. "What is that?" repeated the male voice, now even closer. "Hurry up, Becky, take my hand." Below the words, I thought I could hear the stealthy sliding of something soft over rocks. It seemed like it wasn't too far beyond the tunnel entrance now. But I wasn't going to wait for it. I didn't think what I'd see emerge from the darkness would be a couple of college kids who'd had a rough time of it during a weekend camping trip. Now allowing my panic to run free, I turned and threw myself through the cave breach and landed roughly on the flat stone floor of the mine shaft beyond, skinning my hands to hell and banging my knee on a rock. Scrambling to my feet with a hiss of pain, I ran as fast as I could, only realizing once I finally burst into the waning light of the late afternoon that I had lost my rifle somewhere in that cave. It was darker now than when I first entered the mine, and a quick glance to the sky showed the angry black thunderheads that had moved in, just as promised, and much faster than I'd expected. I quickly swung the iron gate closed on screeching hinges and looped the chain between the bars as tightly as I could, securing it rather lamely with the hasp of the broken padlock. I stood there a long moment, bent over with hands on knees, trying to catch my breath outside the mine entrance. That's when I felt the first drops of the coming storm on the back of my neck. I straightened and looked through the bars of the gate into the ominous darkness beyond, realizing how ridiculous my barricade really was. It wouldn't do much good if something tried to get out, but at least it made me feel a little better, until I heard the voice echoing from the mine shaft, getting closer. It was unmistakable, uncanny. "Hello? Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." That settled it for me. I carefully crawled through the opening and into the space beyond. Shining my light around, I found myself in a small natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with an uneven ceiling of jagged rock that barely cleared my head. The first thing that caught my attention was the cracked lantern lying on the ground. It looked old, very old, maybe 100 years or more. A thick layer of grime and age covered its soot-blackened tin surface, and the glass was thick and uneven. Beside the askew lantern was a small leather-bound book, partially buried in the dirt and dust, with a moldering leather strap securing it closed. It looked like a journal, and without a thought, I tucked it into my backpack. Raising my light to scan around the room again, I called out, "Hello?" I couldn't hear the voices anymore, but the narrow beam of my flashlight illuminated another tunnel in the far corner of the room, mired in darkness. "Can you hear me?" Once again, I got that feeling that something wasn't right. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "Did you hear that?" "Hello? Is someone in there?" she asked, her voice trembling with apprehension. I hesitated, frowning. Something didn't seem right about the voice, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could summon the words to respond, another voice called out. This time, it was clearly the voice of a young man. "We can hear you moving around in there. Please help us. We're lost. And our friend is hurt." I was shouting to them. I sure as hell wasn't trying to hide. Could they not hear me for some reason? I stepped forward to the secondary tunnel and raised my voice again. "I'm with the Forest Service. Can you follow my voice?" It was then, when I reached out to steady myself against the wall of the tunnel entrance, that my hand met something wet, and I recoiled in disgust, thinking I had just grabbed a handful of some subterranean slime. When I put my light on it, however, it became very clear. The reality was far worse. Blood. I stepped back, trying to keep the panic that was fighting to take control of my rationality at bay. I needed to keep a level head. Panning my light around, I saw an astonishing amount of red liquid painting the wall and floor in front of me. Somebody had definitely been hurt, and badly. With loss like this, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stabilize them long enough to get rescue in here. What the hell happened here? And why did the hikers continue into the cave after one of them was injured this badly? Unless they'd lost their light and gotten turned around, there was no way for them to get lost. There hadn't been any branches to this tunnel since I first entered. All they had to do was turn around and walk until they saw daylight. The man's voice called again, colored with the unmistakable tinge of fear. "What is that? Hurry up, Becky! Take my hand!" He seemed to be getting closer. At least if I could guide them to my voice, maybe I could get them out of here. Get to higher ground and radio for a rescue evacuation. They had a helicopter permanently stationed at the main ranger station. It could be here in 20 minutes if I was able to reach them. The woman's voice came again, and this time I froze. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in there?" All at once, it hit me, and the indescribable unease I had been mostly successful in repressing now fought back with renewed vigor. I realized at that moment what I had missed previously. The woman had repeated herself, twice more now. No change in her inflection, no variation in emotion or urgency. It was exactly the same, down to the syllable. It was like I was listening to a recording. "What is that?" repeated the male voice, now even closer. "Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand." Below the words, I thought I could hear the stealthy sliding of something soft over rocks. It seemed like it wasn't too far beyond the tunnel entrance now. But I wasn't going to wait for it. I didn't think that what I'd see emerge from the darkness would be a couple of college kids who'd had a rough time during a weekend camping trip. Now allowing my panic to run free, I turned and threw myself through the cave breach and landed roughly on the flat stone floor of the mine shaft beyond, skinning my hands to hell and banging my knee on a rock. Scrambling to my feet with a hiss of pain, I ran as fast as I could, only realizing, when I finally burst into the waning light of the late afternoon, that I had lost my rifle somewhere in that cave. It was darker than it had been when I first entered the mine, and a quick glance at the sky showed the angry black thunderheads that had moved in, just as promised, much faster than I had expected. I quickly swung the iron gate closed on screeching hinges and looped the chain between the bars as tightly as I could, securing it rather lamely with the hasp of the broken padlock. I stood there a long moment, bent over with hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath outside the mine entrance, when I felt the first drops of the coming storm on the back of my neck. I straightened and looked through the bars of the gate into the ominous darkness beyond, realizing how ridiculous my barricade really was. It wouldn't do much good if something tried to get out, but at least it made me feel a little better, until I heard the voice echoing from the mine shaft, getting closer. It was unmistakable, uncanny. "Hello? Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." By the time dawn arrived the next morning, I had climbed down from my temporary shelter in the low boughs of a red cedar and tried to work out all the painful kinks from my stiff shoulders and neck. The night had not been kind to me, but I was alive, which was more than my fear-stressed mind had expected after yesterday. The night had been harrowing. There was no better word for it. The rain hissed among the trees and stung exposed skin, angrily driven by the banshee wail of the wind rushing through the forest. It was accentuated by the chaotic flashing of lightning and the heart-stopping crack of thunder. Because of this relentless chaos, it's difficult to say with any certainty, but throughout the night, I thought I heard something large trying to move stealthily in the forest near my shelter. I say trying because it felt like whatever stalked through the underbrush was more at home in the unnatural Stygian gloom of the cave than under the watchful eyes of nature. Of course, it could just as easily have been my imagination. When the first dime light of dawn started to illuminate the sodden and dripping forest, I spent the better part of 20 minutes straining my eyes with every ounce of concentration as I scanned the gray woodlands around me. I was only 10 feet or so above the ground, but there was no way I was going to step foot from my hide until I was absolutely certain I was alone. Once I was satisfied, for the moment, I climbed down to the muddy ground. I tried the radio several times through the night and into the morning, but wasn't able to get even a burst of static that might indicate someone was trying to respond. A combination of the storm and the interference from the trees worked against me. My first thought was to get back to my Jeep as quickly as possible and run every drop of gas out of its tank, trying to get as far away from this place as I could. When I checked the GPS to see how close I was to its marked position, however, I found the unit unresponsive, with a disastrous crack across the screen that seemed to mock my dismay, probably caused by my less than graceful scramble from that damned cave. No rifle, no radio, no GPS. Perfect. I still had a compass and the rising sun to guide me, though, and that was something. I was only a couple miles from my tower, which should have been somewhere due south of where I stood. I knew that once I got close, I should be able to either find the service road or the tower itself, so there wasn't much danger of getting myself lost, at least. It was a small comfort, but one I gladly took. I moved through the trees and undergrowth with more speed and recklessness than I probably should have. An ankle broken by an errant misstep would have been bad news. Still, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything of my late-night visitor, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. You know that creeping sense of dread you feel when you've just turned the lights off in a basement and now have to climb the stairs back to the doorway? Or when you're making your way from your car in a darkened, lonely parking lot? It's the feeling that something is there, something much more suited to the dark than you are. It was that same feeling that pushed my footsteps almost to a jog as I traversed the uneven ground and storm-felled detritus that tried to hinder my passage. For the next hour, I moved at this pace, aware with every rasping lungful of breath that I should pause and rest for a few minutes, knowing that pushing myself to fatigue would only increase my chances of falling or hurting myself. I imagined myself lying in blinding pain next to an unseen chuckhole, clutching at a broken leg and watching as the sunlight began to dim with the onset of dusk, waiting for whatever haunted my trail to find me. What would happen then? Would I even have time to look on its visage before it struck? Did those campers in the cave? A misstep and stumble that nearly made this nightmare a self-fulfilled prophecy jarred me back to the present. Against all instinct, I forced my pace to slow, first to a trot, then to a walk. Then, reluctantly, I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath while I scanned the dense woodland around me. Nothing. No, not nothing. As my heart began to slow and my breathing returned to a more manageable cadence, I turned my gaze back in the direction I had been headed, and an unconscious smile found its way to my lips. The sun had risen high in the morning sky during my flight, and now I caught the flash of its reflection on the windows of my tower, not 200 yards directly ahead of me. I laughed aloud with relief, fully aware that the fear-tinted eruption was closer to the manic cackle of lunacy than anything else. I didn't care, though, and my feet started forward again on their own, quickly reaching a brisk pace. A few minutes later, I burst out of the trees into the maintained clearing surrounding my tower, feeling the full sunlight on my face for the first time since yesterday morning. Had it only been a day? It seemed like longer. I was so filled with relief that I didn't even register the fact that a forestry department Jeep sat parked near my fence-enclosed tower until I started entering the combination into the gate lock. The faded white 12 emblazoned on the corner of the windshield told me it was Billy's Jeep, which wasn't much of a surprise, I realized after a moment. After not hearing back from me, I was more surprised I hadn't returned to find an entire search and rescue team making preparations to find their lost puppy. I punched the 4-digit code into the mechanical combination lock on the gate and stepped through, making sure to close and lock it behind me. I stood there a moment, staring through the tall chain-link fence at the dense tree line, wondering if something waited just out of sight in the shadows, staring back at me with hungry anticipation. I shook myself of the sudden chill as best I could and made my way quickly to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Billy was going to be mad at me, I was sure, but the thought was a fleeting one that didn't take purchase. His displeasure was the least of my concerns right now. When I reached the top, I threw open the trapdoor and suddenly found myself looking down the muzzle of a very large rifle. Even in that brief moment of abrupt shock, I could register how the barrel trembled in the hands of its agitated master, and I wondered how close I came to having my life ended in a bright flash of light. The moment only lasted a second or two, and then Billy hastily swung the rifle away in a safe direction. "Damn it, John," he exclaimed, his tone an incongruous mixture of relief and fear. "I almost shot you." I stepped fully through the trapdoor and let it drop closed behind me. "Jesus, Billy," I breathed, leaning back against the railing. I suddenly felt weary and realized it was likely the adrenaline now rushing from my system that had kept me moving at such a hurried pace throughout the morning. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, stepping back inside my shack and taking a chair at the small table in the center of the room. I noted with mild interest that he kept the rifle leaning against the table beside him instead of stowing it in the rack over the door, but decided not to comment on it. Billy Johnson was in his middle years, maybe 45 or so, with a bit of a gut and grayish-brown hair trimmed close. He wore an impressive mustache that reminded me of something an Old West gunslinger might groom. He was dressed in typical attire, khaki Forestry Service shirt and brown cargo pants. In addition to the rifle I'd had the unfortunate opportunity to closely examine a moment earlier, I noticed he wore his .500 Magnum in a holster at his side. That wasn't too unusual when out in the bush. Bears and mountain lions can sneak up on you unaware. Having a hand cannon within easy reach goes a long way toward taking the fight out of them if necessary. It was a little unusual for a drive over to another tower, I supposed, but not exceptionally so, given the circumstances. I took the opposite chair, dropping my pack to the floor next to me. I realized my legs were still shaking anxiously and placed my hands on my knees to try to calm them. He was trying to deflect, but he was horrendously bad at it. He knew something. I was sure of it. "You know where I've been," I replied, gambling on instinct. I watched his face closely for a reaction and wasn't disappointed when he winced and turned his focus out the window and over the forest to the north. "I told you to abort and head back to your tower," he stated brusquely. "But you just had to feed that curiosity of yours, didn't you? You're lucky to be alive, you know that?" From my chair, I reached under the shelf to my right and pulled a half-empty bottle of Jameson and a couple of mostly clean glasses. Billy turned his head and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alcohol was a no-no up here. When I poured and handed him one of the glasses, however, he accepted it without a word. I took a pull from the other. "It's my own damn fault, I suppose," he continued, turning back fully to me. "It's been so long since anyone's even thought of Camp LeClaire that it didn't even click for me when you told me where you saw the campfire." I took another drink, then poured a bit more of the whiskey. "Camp LeClaire, that old mining camp?" I asked. "Logging camp, actually," he corrected me. "The mine was there long before the East Atlantic Logging Company set up out here. Nobody knows who dug it. Hell, nobody even knows when it was dug. A long time before the 19th century, at least. Camp LeClaire was established in 1872, and the mine was old even before that." He looked at me in earnest for the first time since I'd returned and frowned. "You look like hell, John. Got caught in the storm, I'm guessing? Hell of a storm." I only raised my eyebrows, as if to say what an understatement that was. Billy nodded knowingly and took another swallow. "Did you find the campers, at least?" I shook my head and turned to look out the window to the north, where I could almost envision the black void of that mine entrance staring back at me. "No, I tracked them to the mine, but lost them in the cave." I jumped when Billy's glass hit the floor and was out of my chair before I even realized it. Billy hadn't moved from his seat, but now both hands were splayed on the table before him, as if to steady himself. His pale blue eyes were wide and fixed on me. "You went into the cave?" he said, a sudden and horrifying realization dawning on him. It was then I realized my mistake. He hadn't known. He thought I had just discovered the camp and the mine, and then got caught in the storm overnight. A close call, but nothing that couldn't be undone. "Yeah," I replied, nodding slowly, deliberately. "Yeah, I went into that cave, looking for the campers. The gate had been cracked open already. Not sure when, or by who." I leaned forward in my chair and stared hard at him. "Billy, there's something in there. I think it got those campers, and I think it followed me out." Yeah, Billy Johnson's face had gone white then, and I thought for a moment he might pass out. He scooped his glass up from the floor with numb fingers and poured himself another splash of whiskey, downing it in a gulp. When he spoke again, it seemed far away, distant. "Kiwatami. That's what the Chickasaw called it, and they were here long before we ever were. Angler is what the white man called it, among other names. Kiwatami." He nodded. "False brother. Lying men. Or something like that. Hell, I don't know. What do I look like? A translator? It means bad, no matter what language you speak. It means something is out there that isn't supposed to be. Something that was locked away a long time ago, and forgotten." It was then that he stood and grabbed up his rifle, as if suddenly remembering something. "I need to get back to my tower and make a call." "No," I gestured to the radio base station sitting patiently on the table near the door. "Why not use mine?" Billy shook his head. "Sorry, John, but it doesn't work that way. Special phone, special number. I just hope I'm not too late." I started to stand. "I'll go with you," I said. He pointed a stern finger at me and narrowed his eyes. "No, you stay here. Strap on your handgun and make sure it's loaded." His voice was calm, almost cold, and didn't leave much room for debate. Still, I had no desire to stay here alone with whatever this angler thing was, roaming around out there. "Billy, I can go with you. I can help." I started to argue, but was quickly cut off when he took a menacing step toward me, and I realized just how much I'd underestimated him because of his normally easy manner. "You will stay in your damn tower, and you will follow your orders," he roared. I unconsciously took a step back and reclaimed my seat, only managing a shaken nod in acknowledgement. He took a trembling breath, pointed at the radio, and said in a slightly less terrifying tone, "And keep that thing on. As soon as I'm back at my tower, I'll radio you with updates." A moment later, he was gone, and the trapdoor slammed shut behind him. I stood and retrieved the Pelican case from under my cot. Inside was the same model of Magnum revolver that Billy had been wearing, heavy and cold in my hands. I loaded it and belted on the leather holster, feeling the reassuring weight tugging at my waist. "John?" I heard Billy call from below. I went outside to the walkway, leaning over the railing. He was standing beside his Jeep 50 feet below, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as he looked up at me. "Make sure to keep everything locked. I'll come back for you," he shouted. I raised a hand to him and slid the latch shut on the trapdoor with my toe. I turned back into my shack just as I heard Billy's Jeep fire up, and a moment later, drive off down the rough service road toward his tower. I glanced back to the north, to the place where I had first seen the campfire smoke rising the day before, and suppressed a shudder. I was alone again, safe in my tower and armed, but alone. Abruptly, like an unexpected wave of nausea, the feeling that I was being watched washed over me with a chill, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked back over my shoulder to where Billy had been only a minute before, but saw only the rough service road and the dense, impenetrable tree line beyond that. Probably just my imagination. But the feeling didn't diminish, and with every passing breath, I was more and more certain that there was something nearby, just out of sight, standing stone still in the gray-green foliage, waiting. I stood there a long moment, eyes straining for any hint of movement or alien shape among the shadows. But if it was there, my human eyes weren't sharp enough to pick it out. I stepped back through the open doorway of my shack and dropped down into the chair again, my eyes catching the bottle of whiskey before me. I was tempted to pour another drink to help settle my nerves, but I could already feel the tickle of a buzz at the edges of my mind from what I'd already drunk, and quickly decided that the last thing I needed was for my reflexes and awareness to be dulled right now. I'd made more than one poor decision in the last 24 hours. I didn't think adding another to the pile was such a great idea. Grabbing the bottle, I screwed the cap back on and reached to return it to the sparse shelf to my right. As I did so, my boot caught my pack, knocking it over. Without a thought, I reached down to move it out of the way, and then remembered the old weathered journal tucked inside the front pocket, the one I'd found in the cave. I reached into the unzipped front pocket. For a frustrating, alarming moment, my searching hand couldn't feel anything in the compartment, and I feared I had lost it in my chaotic escape. But then my fingers brushed the familiar shape, and I withdrew it, setting it in front of me on the table. I could see the book much more clearly now in the daylight. It wasn't overly large, just a little bigger than my hand, and maybe the thickness of my thumb. There were no markings on the front, except for a simple, grimy brass loop that secured the leather strap holding it closed. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was inside, but I needed some answers. Anything. A stray sound from the trees below rose to my ears, and I froze, listening intently for more. But none came. The forest around me was silent again, and I turned my attention back to the journal, pulling the strap free from the cover and turning to the first page. From the pocket of Andrew Robinson, it said. The writing was neat and compact and distinctly male. The ink was a rich black, scrawled upon brittle yellow pages, and though faded with the years, was still mostly legible. I turned to the next page, where the entries began. I felt as though I had dropped into his account midway, as though this was just the latest in a series of journals that this Andrew Robinson had been keeping. July 23rd, 1891. After nearly a week of hard overland trekking, we reached the abandoned camp late this afternoon, exactly where the old trapper said we would. Sikwahi, our Pawnee tracker, has once again astonished me with his overland navigation skills. I must admit, I was skeptical at the yarn the old trapper had spun in the crowded confines of the common house in Dunn Creek, especially after I smelled the drink on his breath. But the professor never doubted him for a moment. The man's instincts for reading human character are absolutely singular. The camp looks to have been abandoned, and I have to admit to a certain unease as we inspected the rough cabins. There isn't a soul to be found, and it looks years abandoned, yet everything stands as if awaiting the loggers' return at any moment. Strange. July 24th, 1891. Our small troop of intrepid adventurers made camp in the center of LeClaire last night. Though the cabins likely would have been more comfortable, I doubt any of us would have felt at ease intruding upon them. Richards laughed it off when someone mentioned how peculiar it was that the loggers had departed in such a hurry that they abandoned their personal possessions. But I could see in his eyes that he found it odd as well. Sequoia, our ever-courageous and solid guide, seemed ill at ease and unusually withdrawn, refusing all conversation and only responding to queries with quiet grunts. Something of concern hides behind his eyes, though I wonder what it is. Only the professor seems unmoved by the unusually still atmosphere of this place, and his typically infectious positivity keeps working at our unease, keeping it from expanding beyond its current state. Today, we spent much of the day exploring the area surrounding Camp LeClaire, and the sunlight was nearly spent when Dobson burst back into camp with news of his discovery. We, all of us, raced at a moment's notice behind him as he led us along an ill-used and nigh invisible footpath that led ever upward upon the site of the northern rocky slope. When the path terminated, we were deposited before a truly curious sight. A barricaded tunnel entrance had been bored into the rock face by some unknown hands. I suspect some sort of exploration tunnel or adit dug in search of precious ores, especially given the nation's more recent history with gold fever. The wooden barrier, roughly assembled from a hodgepodge of heavy timber beams, was curious, and several of our group commented on it, but the professor dismissed it as a triviality. So the matter was dropped. It is far too late in the day to proceed further, but we plan to penetrate the barricade and enter the tunnel in the morning. The excitement among the men is palpable. July 25th, 1891. Sequoia is gone. He took his supplies and his prized Winchester rifle and fled sometime during the night like a phantom. This is a shocking blow to us all, but none more so than to the professor, with whom the Pawnee Tracker had partnered for a number of years across much of the eastern states. We have no explanation for his sudden desertion, and it sits ill with the entirety of the group. The overall mood has darkened, I fear. Still, we must push onward. July 25th, 1891. Addendum. It took more than 2 hours of hard labor, but we were finally able to gain entrance to the mine shortly before noon today. Richards managed to get his boot caught between two heavy timbers as he stumbled forward, straining his ankle with a terrible cry. We feared it broken, but Dr. Franklin assured us that the bones seemed intact. Regardless, Richards was taken back to the camp, where he will convalesce while the rest of us make our entry. His part in our exploration has come to an end for now. We made our way in single file through the adit tunnel for some way before reaching its carved end. The light from our oil lanterns, providing regrettably inadequate illumination over the rocky surroundings. When we reached the terminus of the mine tunnel, our hearts sank for a moment, before the professor gave an exclamation of discovery and suddenly disappeared through a nearly hidden rift in the wall, surrounded by jagged rocks. We eagerly followed him through, careful of our footing as we went, and found ourselves in what I can only assume to be an accidental breach by the miners into a natural cave system. The air was chill and moving, but our excitement at this discovery allayed any concerns or discomfort it might have caused. The professor directed us to set a secondary camp in this new chamber, which will be used as a staging point for further exploration. So we spent the rest of the day bringing supplies from our main camp and constructing a smaller version in this moderately sized chamber. By the time we completed this endeavor, the efforts of the day precluded a start to the exploration until the group had the opportunity to rest and replenish their energy. I feel I will sleep well tonight, despite the anxious excitement buzzing around my mind. July 26th, 1891 once. Another shock. When we awoke this morning, O'Connor was gone. The Irishman, who has ever been reliable and constant as the North Star, was assigned first watch last night. There is no trace of him, and no indication that he took any provisions or even his personal rucksack with him. I fear his natural inquisitiveness may have gotten the best of him and led him to explore the deeper caverns beyond our ad hoc base camp, for his lantern is the sole item that has gone missing with his person. The professor immediately rallied the rest of our small group, 7 in all now, and mounted a search for our lost companion. I tried to caution him against rushing into action, but he was not to be deterred. To my dismay, I was the sole man ordered to remain here at camp, whilst my companions took up their supplies and launched deeper into the cave system, in the event O'Connor returned in their absence. I was understandably disappointed, but grasped the logic of it well enough. I would loathe to think of O'Connor returning only to find us all gone, and then losing himself again trying to find us. I shall endeavor to rest a bit. With luck, my companions will return before long with our lost compatriot. July 27th, 1891. I am at my wit's end and am unsure how to proceed. It has been more than a day since the professor led the rest of the men in search of poor O'Connor, and I have felt their absence as keenly as I am aware of my own solitude in this cave. I have seen nothing of our missing companion or of the party that delved deeper into the system yesterday morning, and I know their lanterns did not have sufficient fuel to carry them this long without other means of illumination to guide their return. I fear they are hopelessly lost. I myself had to return to Leclerc for more lantern oil for my own waning light. I must admit, with no little embarrassment, some reluctance at my return to this dark place, which no longer carries any of its former adventurous excitement or fascination. It is now nothing more than a doorway into the deep places below the earth where men were never intended to tread. But the growing apprehension is not the worst of it. The sounds. By heaven's grace, the sounds. I first became aware of them last night as I dimmed my lantern and tried to set myself to sleep. At first, it was only an indistinct and muted echo that may have been interpreted as nothing more than the distant whistle of wind or other natural sound, distorted by the unique acoustics of this place. But then I heard the distinct tonal qualities that could only be a man's voice. I instantly rose and took up my lantern, raising the flame and rushing to the entrance of the cave that had swallowed my companions. There I stood, listening with such keen focus that I felt beads of sweat upon my brow. I would swear upon a holy book that it was the distant calls of the professor himself, and I eagerly called back with as much fervor as I could summon, hoping desperately to guide them back to me. However, the instant I called out, the voices vanished, and I was met only with the suffocating silence of an open tomb. There I stood, straight as a sentinel, praying for a response from my friends. After several minutes of absolute silence, my thoughts began turning to dark things. I became painfully aware that anything beyond the weak cast of my lantern would be utterly invisible to me. But I, on the other hand, would be lighted as a beacon to it. I pushed these thoughts from my mind as forcefully as I could, inwardly chastising myself for seeing ghouls where none existed, and was about to call out again to my lost companions when I heard it. The voice came again, echoing from the claustrophobic abyss that lay before me, mired in the blackest darkness one could imagine. It was still some distance away, but I was certain it seemed closer now. When I heard it a third time, I was just barely able to make out the words, but it was enough to be sure. My own words echoed back to me from the depths of that cave, in my own voice. I staggered and nearly dropped the lantern at that moment. Could the legends be true? The professor always seemed to believe them, though I must admit I attributed his faith to the unwavering certainty he held in those things lost to antiquity. He had always maintained that a legend, especially one whispered by so many indigenous peoples without mutual contact, must have some root in truth. But that line of reasoning is antithetical to modern civility, and I must reject it. I must focus on the more probable explanation, that my already stressed nerves were turning my fears against me. The voices must be those of my companions, lost in the dark but near enough to hear their calls. They must be. I am not certain what lies next, but I know that I cannot abandon my companions, my friends, to wander the darkness until they fall from exhaustion or dehydration. not while I might yet help them. I will leave this written account at the entrance to the cave. This lantern is nearly spent, but I have another with a full vessel that I will take instead. If I do not return, at least someone may know of our passing here. May God be with us all." I closed the journal with a trembling hand, momentarily lost in what I had just read. How is it possible? The journal was more than 130 years old. No animal alive then could be what pursued me now. What if it's not an animal? The sudden burst of static from Billy's call, simultaneously erupting from my radio base station and the portable handset clipped to my shoulder, made me jump and drop the journal on the floor. Heart pounding, I cursed under my breath and keyed the microphone. "Tower 9, I answered, my voice tight as I spoke. My eyes drifted out across the sky to the east, where darkened thunderheads had been unknowingly gathering and marching slowly in my direction. I shook my head. Icing on the cake, I thought. "John, what's your position?" asked Billy. The self-assured authority that had filled his tone before was strangely absent, now replaced with something else: fear. I frowned a moment at the question before answering. "Where do you think, Billy?" "I'm in my tower, just like you told me." A strange pause came before he spoke again. "John, this isn't some sort of joke, right? You're not outside of my tower?" I was growing more agitated by the moment. What sort of question was that? I had no Jeep. There was no way I could have made it to his tower in such a short amount of time, even if I'd wanted to. "No, Billy," I answered with more force than I'd intended. "I'm not outside of your tower." I stopped mid-sentence, a horrified realization sweeping over me in that moment. I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. It was all I could muster. The radio was silent as my eyes slowly drifted to the west, where I could just make out the small, lonely shape of Tower 12, barely visible over the darkening blanket of green. Was that a gunshot? Another damn night stuck in this window-lined prison. At least I have a good view, so I guess that's something. The storm raged all night again last night, and only let up just before dawn. At one point, the winds were gusting hard enough to rock the stand out on the wet catwalk around my shack. I see that the clouds haven't let us go just yet, and they look every bit as ticked off as they did yesterday afternoon. It seems like the dry season has come to an end, which is good, since I've been slacking a bit on my fire-watching duties over the last couple of days. Gallows humor, right? It's either that or sitting in the corner in a fetal position crying, and I've been told by my ex-fiancée that I'm not an attractive crier. I haven't heard a peep from Billy since his last terrifying broadcast to me yesterday. I've tried to reach him several times since then, but no dice. I've also tried reaching Nathan at the ranger station, but all I get is static, even from my base radio set. When I first started here, I remember Billy telling me during my brief orientation that the radio should be able to reach out 50 miles or more, so I'm not sure what's going on with it. I just took a quick look at the base station and found that the cable leading up to the antenna on the roof of the shack is now just a dangly thing swaying in the breeze. The storm must have decided it needed the antenna more than I did, because it's gone. I can see where the screws were torn out of the wooden mast. And before you say anything about whatever this thing is that's been stalking around deciding to sabotage my radio, I should probably tell you that the wooden antenna mast looks like it's been around for a long time. The wood was probably dry rotted to begin with, and now that it's soaked, it crumbled away in little wet brown bits as soon as I probed at it with my fingers. Speaking of whatever this Kiwatami or angler thing is, I'm just going to call it a mimic, I think. I haven't heard or sensed anything weird since yesterday. I'm assuming it's still out there somewhere, but I don't think it's nearby. If it's still anywhere around here, it's probably somewhere near Tower 12, or at least that's what makes the most sense to me. Anyway, which brings me to my shiny new lunatic idea. My Jeep. It can't be more than a mile down the northern track, still sitting there in front of that fallen pine. I could probably get to it in less than an hour, even with the wet and muddy ground. It had almost a full tank of gas, and I'm pretty sure I could outrun this mimic thing in it if I can get onto a straight shot of service road. I definitely don't relish the idea, mind you. Every instinct is screaming at me to sit my butt right where I am in this tower. I know the ranger station will start getting a little antsy when Billy doesn't check in after a few days, but I'm also thinking they may extend it out a day or two in light of the foul weather. Maybe 5 days at the outside, and then I'll have a ranger truck parked outside my tower. The question is, what will they find when they get here? See, I've been thinking about it. Billy definitely knew more about this thing than I do. Certainly enough to not open the door for it when he heard it outside, pretending to be a Girl Scout selling cookies. That makes me think that maybe the fence and the trapdoor might not be enough to stop it if it really wants in. As terrifying as the prospect of leaving the tower and making for the Jeep is, sitting here, cornered in my window-lined shack, just waiting for it to show up in the middle of the night, is even worse. At least I have a chance out there. I still have the Magnum. It's been holstered on my belt since yesterday. They don't issue pea shooters for bear protection out here. This thing is the most powerful handgun in mass production. It'll put down anything in North America, as long as you can hit it right. Any normal animal anyway. Who knows what this thing is capable of? Still, it does provide a level of comfort and gives me some confidence that my plan may work if luck's on my side. For now, I'm going to try to eat a granola bar, put something in my churning stomach, and try to build a little energy. I don't think I've eaten anything since early yesterday. After that, I'm grabbing my pack and heading out. Wish me luck. I left my tower shortly after 10 a.m., and let me tell you, those were some of the most difficult first steps I've ever taken in my life. Stepping out through the chain link gate into the open space beyond my small compound felt like I was stepping off the roof of a skyscraper. When I closed the gate behind me, I just stood there, motionless, for what must have been 5 minutes. Frozen in place, with my hand clenching the grip of the revolver still holstered at my belt. Even with all the stress and anxiety swirling around in my head, I was amazed at exactly how keen my senses seemed in that moment. It felt like I could hear every rustle of leaves and smell every damp patch of moss in the thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding me. In that moment, I felt very small, very insignificant, trivial. When my chest began to ache, I realized I had been holding a breath in. Subconsciously afraid to make even the slightest sound, I let it out slowly and forced myself to breathe normally again. Scanning the trees, I turned slowly in a circle, eyes searching for anything that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. But there was nothing there. Everything seemed normal, at least to me. Casting one last look over my shoulder at the refuge of my tower, I started off along the seldom used service road to the north, careful of my footing on the muddy and uneven ground. I allowed myself to move at a slow jog, fast enough to make good progress, but not so fast that I was announcing my presence to the world. Not so fast that I couldn't hear the forest around me over my own breathing. I stopped a couple of times during my trek to catch my breath and take a drink of water, and thankfully still seemed alone and unpursued. For now. I wondered if it was out there somewhere among the dense trees, hiding in the muted gray shadows of the forest. Maybe it was looking for me at that moment. Perhaps it had returned to my tower in my absence, found it empty, and was even now tracking my flight along this trail. If I paused long enough, would I see it suddenly rounding the gentle curve behind me as it caught up? Or did it prefer to move more stealthily among the trees and underbrush, laying in wait alongside the path ahead, ready for my approach? I had to forcibly shake myself of that line of thought. It wasn't doing me any good. Not now. I was committed to my plan. The thought of retracing my steps and returning to my lonely watchtower held just as much terror, because now it sat there unmanned, unwatched, abandoned. For all I know, the mimic could be there at this very moment, ransacking my shack. I definitely didn't want to walk back in on that little scene. I can promise you that much. I ended up making surprisingly good time on that northern path, It was only about 30 minutes before I saw the dim shape of my Jeep waiting dutifully in the middle of the path ahead. The matte tan paint job and black cloth roof stood out remarkably well against the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Urging my pace to quicken, I covered the last 100 yards before I even realized it and found myself standing at the door and door handle. I paused. A chill ran down my spine, inciting an unbidden shiver. I realized then how quiet the forest around me was, and I wasn't sure how long it had been this way. I felt that something was out of place, and so did the native fauna. On any given day, the trees were alive with the sounds of wildlife. Squirrels and chipmunks chittered, insects buzzed, and 1,000 varieties of birds called and sang from the treetops. Not now, though. It was as if they had all left. And I felt very alone in that moment. Only, not quite alone. Somewhere out there in that sea of trees, something stalked, something that didn't belong in the light of day, something that didn't belong under the watchful eyes of Mother Nature. I was pretty sure she wouldn't have let something like the mimic evolve, had it not been hidden in its underground realm. The door of the Jeep was, thankfully, quiet as I depressed the latch and swung it open. If this had been a horror movie, I'm sure an ear-splitting screech would have erupted from its hinges, but in real life, we tend to take care of these vehicles pretty well. In the best of times, they're the only convenient way to travel for 20 miles or more. In times like this, though, it was likely the only thing that would save me. I jumped in and pulled the door shut behind me with a dull thunk, subconsciously locking it. I almost laughed aloud when I did that. The entire top of the Jeep was nothing more than canvas and plastic windows. A feisty hamster could probably have penetrated my little haven. I doubt the mimic would even think twice about it. The Jeep fired up immediately when I turned the key in the ignition, and I threw it in reverse for the most ungraceful 14-point turn you've ever seen on the narrow and muddy service road. Once I got turned around, I didn't waste any time directing it back the way I came. The service road was really little more than an uneven and ill-maintained dirt trail, and was only ever used infrequently by the rangers and lookouts. As I'd previously mentioned, it was a rough ride, even for the heavy suspension of my trusty steed. So I had to keep it at a reasonable speed. The very last thing I needed was to snap an axle or bounce myself right off the road and into the trees. Compound the condition of the trail with the fact that it constantly curved as it progressed, and it meant that even my best speed wasn't too much faster than I could run on foot. That's okay. Once I got past my tower, the service road was generally better maintained and followed a more or less straight path. I'd be able to build some decent speed there, and I'd be out of the wilderness and standing at the ranger station in an hour or so. The abrupt appearance of my tower caused me to feather off the gas as I rounded the last curve from the northern track. I slowed to a crawl and squinted through the now dirty windshield. From here, everything looked exactly like I had left it. The gate still stood closed, and looking up, I could see the trapdoor also appeared shut. Maybe this thing hadn't returned. Hell, maybe this thing wasn't ever going to return. For all I knew, it was headed in the opposite direction. It's not like it had a GPS or anything. It was at that moment that I nearly scared myself when the radio, still clipped to my belt, squawked, and I heard probably the last thing I had expected to hear. "Billy? Sean, are you there?" The signal was pretty clear, but his voice sounded weak. I almost didn't respond. I was frozen, indecision clouding my mind. I didn't know what I could trust to be true, but I doubted that this mimic had read the radio manual and learned to operate the handset. I snatched the handset from my shoulder and keyed the mic. "Billy? Holy crap, is that you?" He answered me right away, and I thought I could hear relief in his tone, buried under his pained words. "John, thank God. I was afraid you were gone." My eyes drifted to the trail leading past my tower, toward the ranger station, toward safety. Another 5 minutes, and I would have been over. "I've got my Jeep, and I was just about to haul it for the ranger station," I replied. "What's your status?" There was a moment of silence, and I wondered briefly if he'd even heard me. But then he answered, I'm not doing too good, John. I'm in my tower, but that thing hurt me. I've been drifting in and out. I patched myself up as best I could, but I can't stop the cut on my leg. I frowned and closed my eyes for a moment, asking a question I was pretty sure I knew the answer to. Are you able to get to your Jeep? I thought I heard a coughing bark of laughter before he answered. I don't think so. I'm pretty banged up. What happened? The thing got into my tower. I managed to get off a shot at it, but not before it got the jump on me, he explained. It took off before it did me in, so I think I hit it. I don't know where it is now, though. My tower is wide open, and it hasn't come back, so maybe it's gone. I doubted that. Things never work out that simple. Are you stable? Can you be moved? Another silence. And then, I know what you're thinking. Haul it to the ranger station. That's an order. I dropped my forehead to the steering wheel, closing my eyes and cursing. It would have been easier if Billy hadn't radioed me. I know it's selfish. I know I'm a jerk for even thinking it. But I could have been blissfully out of range if he had only waited another 10 minutes. I could still put the throttle down and get out of here. I could still race for the ranger station and have them mobilize a chopper to come back for Billy. But they were at least an hour away. Factor in the spin-up and travel time for the helicopter, and you're talking more like an hour and a half before anyone gets to him. He didn't sound good. Something told me it was unlikely he would last that long. I could still turn left. I'd likely survive. But could I live with myself knowing that I left Billy to pass alone in his tower? What if our situations had been reversed? Sure, I might be saying the same words he was saying now, but in my heart, I'd be pleading for that voice on the radio to help me. I couldn't imagine being in his position, lying there hurt and running out of time, knowing that his safe haven was wide open and that thing was out there somewhere. Look, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're probably already saying. Don't be stupid. This is exactly why everyone dies in a horror movie. I get it. Believe me, I get it. But this isn't a movie, and my friend is lying there in his shack. If I can get to him and get him into the Jeep, we can both be out of here, leaving all this twisted nightmare behind us. Billy, I'm headed your way. Get ready, because we're going to wrestle you down the stairs and into my Jeep as quickly as we can, I said, cranking the wheel to the right and taking the western trail with more speed than I should have. John, I gave you an order. Get out of here, now. Despite the situation, I managed a sardonic grin as my rig bucked and bounced over the uneven trail. Billy, I'd like to take this opportunity to officially tender my resignation from the Fire Watch. Now shut your mouth and conserve your strength. I'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes turned out to be a pretty good guess. Before long, I skidded to a halt outside Tower 12, next to Billy's ride. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet air, my handgun coming out of its holster and held before me like some sort of shield. I took a quick moment to let my eyes roam over the surrounding woodlands for any sign of movement before quickly jogging around my Jeep and toward the compound's entrance. I passed through the open doorway, taking note of the heavy chain-link gate that was lying twisted 15 feet inside the fence. Another dozen paces, and I was at the base of the stairs, craning my neck to make sure nothing was awaiting me above. I keyed the mic at my shoulder and said in a low voice, "Billy, I'm outside your tower right now. Heading up? Don't shoot me." I turned the volume down just in time for his response. "Damn it, John, I told you to leave." But despite his words, the gratitude and relief were clear in his tone. I started up the stairs, revolver still held at the ready as my other hand ran tightly along the railing. My eyes were drawn to the red-black spot staining the gray paint of the steel steps. I found even more of the viscous fluid on the railing as I continued my ascent. Blood, but not Billy's. Good. I hope that idiot is lying in the woods, breathing its last breath. He definitely hit it, but I had no way of telling how seriously it was hurt. In a human, bright red indicated an arterial bleed, a significant injury. But with this thing, who knew what black-red meant? I climbed the rest of the staircase as it ran around the tower and stopped just below the open trapdoor. "Billy?" I called out cautiously. A pause. Then came his reply. Shaky and with a wheezing sound I didn't like at all. How do I know it's you? Say something that this idiot couldn't have heard you say before. I've always admired and respected you, I answered without hesitation. Jerk, he muttered. Come on up. I took another couple of steps, cautiously poking my head through the trapdoor. Billy was sitting upright, more or less, resting his back against the doorframe of his shack and aiming his own handgun generally in my direction. As soon as he saw my face, he dropped his hand to his side, the stainless steel barrel falling against the metal walkway. As I stepped fully through the trapdoor, I noted two things immediately. First, there was a significant amount of that black red splattered around. Second, I realized how badly injured Billy was. His face had gone gray with a sickly paleness, and his breaths came in ragged hitches. Soaked bandages wrapped both forearms, and the side of his face was covered with a crimson rag taped haphazardly down. His entire khaki park shirt was painted in a hellish tie-dye of shades of red. But it was his leg that worried me most. A tourniquet had been tied around his thigh, but the pant leg below that was cherry red and glistening in the late morning light. Jesus, Billy, I exclaimed, holstering my gun and rushing to his side. He waved me off as I knelt beside him. I know it looks bad. Save it for later. Let's get out of here before that thing decides to come back for another round. I nodded and stood again, taking a quick glance past him and into his shack, a twin to my own tower. Normally, Billy's looked like a war zone. Now, his table and desk had both been overturned and smashed, along with his base-set radio. On the floor nearby was a satellite phone, its antenna and display obviously smashed during the attack. Lifting his arm over my head, I helped him to his feet. He grimaced in pain, but threw his remaining strength into it, and with mine, we began the precarious descent through his trapdoor. Did you at least get to make your phone call? I asked him as we took the steps carefully and agonizingly slow. He shook his head. It got here just as I was getting ready to. It was using your voice, telling me that you were from the Park Service and that you were here to help. He looked at me with shaken astonishment. It sounded just like you, John, but when I looked over the catwalk railing down at it, he winced again as we half stumbled on a step. Almost there, I said. He continued, Holy hell, I've never seen anything like it. I shook my head as we reached the bottom step and moved onto the rain-soaked ground, grunting with exertion. Save it, Billy. We've got a long ride ahead of us. Plenty of time for that later. He just nodded as I maneuvered him around to the passenger side of my Jeep and helped him climb in. Once he was in, I hurried back around to the driver's side and got in, starting the engine as I pulled the door closed behind me. Throwing it into reverse, I felt the wheels break loose as I stepped on the gas with a bit too much enthusiasm. I swung the 4x4 around and put it into drive, pointing it back toward my tower and beyond, toward safety. I only had a heartbeat's warning from Billy before I saw it, barreling from the underbrush at us. It threw itself, a great mess, crashing into the side of the Jeep, and Billy scrambled to get away from it, dang near climbing over the center console in the process and knocking my hands off the wheel in his panic. The Jeep swung wildly left, and I stomped down on the brakes to avoid careening off into the trees. One of the front wheels dipped off the road, and the steel bumper crashed through a small cluster of oak saplings, halting us abruptly and stalling the engine. Everything went silent in that moment as we froze. My breath hitched in my lungs, and my eyes widened in shock as I laid eyes upon this abomination for the first time. My first impression was that it was much larger than I had thought, but the nightmare visage before me eclipsed such a pedestrian observation. The thing stood in the middle of the trail, still shaking its head as if trying to recover its senses after the collision with the 2-ton vehicle. It looked vaguely humanoid in a sense, but it walked on forelimbs clearly proportioned to such a task. It was hairless, with mottled pink-gray skin stretched tight over muscles, bones, and odd, unidentifiable growths. The limbs seemed to have joints that bent in all the wrong directions and ended in what should have been claws. But instead of the distinctive keratin-composed sharp nails so familiar in the natural world, these seemed to be extensions of the creature's skeletal structure, protruding painfully through its veiny, translucent hide. But worst of all was the bulbous and disproportionately large head that topped an oddly gaunt neck. It was oblong and reminded me of the shape of a feline skull in general appearance. Its maw seemed to jag a tear across its face, with ill-fitting and chaotically positioned teeth that didn't seem to allow the mouth to close properly. I couldn't see any eyes, but where they should have been were instead two bulbous, cyst-like organs, seeming to bulge and flatten in a slow rhythm, as if bladders filling with air or liquid. I reeled back in revulsion as it turned its sightless head in our direction, searchingly. Flaps of skin on either side of its malformed snout opened slowly, like some obscene blossom composed of milky gray bat wings, and I had the sense that it was using them to somehow locate us. It was then I saw where Billy's shot had struck the creature in the face. One of the snout flaps was nearly completely cut, hanging limp in contrast to its sibling, and a gouge furrowed by the shot's travel creased along the right side of the thing's head. When it turned its head farther in our direction, I could see clearly where it had bled significantly from the shot, but was horrified to see that the wound had already sealed itself, and a shiny silver scar was left to mark the incident. "I knew I hit you," Billy whispered. The mimic stopped its motion. A moment later, the twisted sound of a human voice assaulted our ears. "I know you're out there." The voice was unmistakably Billy's, but distorted and wrong. I thought that the injury from his shot probably had something to do with that. The thing raised its head again, turning a bit more in our direction, and took a few experimental steps forward. Again, it paused and lowered its head. This time we heard what sounded like the pained roar of a bear, almost perfectly replicated, except for that same distortion we had heard previously. Had this thing got a bear? I held my breath as we watched it again raise its head and take a few more contemplative steps in our direction, slowly swinging its grotesque snout back and forth. I could see how the flaps of skin that were flared open where its nose should have been twitched minutely side to side, and I felt like it was using them to listen for us. "It knows we're here somewhere, but it can't see us," whispered Billy, leaning close. "But if it gets close enough, I'm thinking we're done for." I looked over at Billy and realized there was no way he'd be able to make a run for it in his condition. From the look of the thing growing ever closer to where we cowered in the Jeep, I thought it was likely we didn't have much time before it got close enough to hear our breathing, or heartbeats, or whatever, even inside the 4x4. When that happened, I knew what would come next. Billy closed his eyes a moment and turned to me. There was something in his eyes then, some sort of acceptance that I didn't like one bit. "Get ready with that cannon," he whispered. "You're only going to get one chance at this." "What are you talking about?" I asked. A moment later, I had my answer. Billy took a deep breath and mustered every bit of his strength, flinging the door open and staggering out of the Jeep. "I'm right here," he shouted at the thing, limping weakly across the road away from the Jeep. The mimic whipped its head in his direction instantly, but tilted its head to the side, seemingly momentarily puzzled at this unexpected turn of events. Billy held his own magnum in his hand, but he was too weak to raise it toward the beast. Still, he pulled the trigger, and the resounding boom seemed to shake the air. The mimic flinched at the deafening sound of the shot, the membranes at its snout snapping shut protectively, but its stunned hesitation didn't last long. In an instant, faster than I would have thought possible, it launched itself on powerful limbs at Billy, knocking him to the ground and going at him with teeth and claws. I heard my friend start screaming then, a horrible, soul-rending sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. But now was my chance, and I took it. I swung the door open and stepped out of the Jeep, my gun coming free of its holster in the same movement. The creature was preoccupied with what was left of Billy, but as soon as I brought the gun up and thumbed back the hammer, its head whipped around at me. It crouched like a compressed spring, preparing to launch. But I was quicker. The report of the shot was incredible, and the recoil of the powerful round rocked my wrist back painfully. The beast staggered, and I saw a burst of red explode from near where its shoulder met its neck. It howled, an otherworldly cry, sounding like a bedlam mixture of man and beast. But though the wound seemed terrible, it tried once again to throw itself at me. I was set in my course, though, and took step after step toward the creature, pulling the trigger again and again until the gun ran dry, and all I was left with was the clicking of the hammer and the high-pitched ringing in my ears. The acrid smell of gunpowder stunned my nose, and by the time I finally stopped, I found myself within only a few feet of the terrible thing. 6 blackened holes stippled the neck and torso of the creature where the shots had entered, and I knew the destruction of their exits on the opposite side would be far worse. The mimic lay across Billy Johnson, its weight crushing whatever had been left of my friend. Black-red fluid spread out from beneath the thing like an oil spill across a smooth floor. I noted with some muted surprise that the creature still twitched and slowly flexed its powerful muscles, and a wheezing sound was quietly emanating from the top of its head. I holstered my empty handgun and scanned around the sodden ground for what I knew was there. A moment later, I spotted it. Billy's own Magnum, lying half buried in the muck where it had been torn from his grip under the weight of the monster. I snatched it up and shook it clear of most of the mud and grass. Opening the cylinder, I saw that only 1 unfired round remained. That was enough. I approached the thing before me without apprehension or pause, my eyes focused on this monster that had caused such pain and terror. I thumbed the hammer back and placed the muzzle against the mimic, which still moved with some small remaining life. I didn't know if it would be able to heal from the wounds I had already inflicted. Logic told me it was unlikely, but the silvery scar I had seen from Billy's previous encounter caused me to question everything I thought was possible. I felt the tremors from the creature vibrate through the gun as the barrel rested against its head, right between where its eyes should have been. I tensed my finger on the cool steel of the trigger, and the crack of the shot echoed through the forest. It was done. But even as I walked back numbly to the Jeep and restarted the engine, I wondered if that was true. I thought back to the journal I had read, written more than 130 years before, and how it had alluded to tales of this creature going back long before then. As I drove the Jeep along the rough and winding service road, I wondered at the possibility that what we encountered wasn't the only one of its kind, that this same beast had somehow terrorized cultures separated from each other by great time and distance, spawning the legends that the author of the journal and his companions had pursued. It didn't seem likely, and now the door was open. I knew the night was off to a strange start the minute I checked in. The ranger station, which normally felt like a second home to me, seemed smaller and lonelier than usual. Even the warm glow from the overhead lights couldn't chase away the gloom pouring in from the windows. I stepped inside, figuring I'd see Pat, Marcus, and Dana gathered around the battered table in the corner, trading jokes while we waited out another quiet shift. Instead, I found them pacing around, each one fiddling with equipment or rechecking logs. It was my turn to do a final walkthrough outside. Usually, I enjoyed strolling around under the moonlight, scoping out the tree line for raccoons or wandering deer. Tonight, the moon was hidden behind roiling clouds, and the path beyond the station was pitch black. The wind whipped across the roof, making the beams groan. I half wondered if the entire structure would shake itself apart. After a few minutes of testing the locks and listening for anything unusual, I stepped back inside, my jacket dripping with cold dew. Pat gave me this look that said, "All good out there?" I nodded, but I didn't really feel certain. Before I could settle at the desk, Dana spoke up. She's usually the practical one, never letting gossip or superstitions rattle her. But her expression was guarded. She asked if we'd ever heard rumors about the Phantom of Hollow Grove. Marcus let out a nervous laugh, but Pat's face turned serious. Dana explained how this old local legend had been passed around since before any of us were hired, a name tied to unexplained vanishings, especially when the moon was at its fullest. She didn't sound like she was spinning a campfire story. Her voice was calm, too calm, like she was remembering something unsettling. The station lights flickered just then. It might have been a hiccup in the power, but it made every single nerve in me go on alert. Even the fireplace, which usually made the room cozy, seemed to cast weird shadows across the walls. Pat ventured to the window and peered out. The glass was flecked with condensation, making it tough to see anything but vague outlines of trees shifting in the wind. Marcus, normally the easygoing one, was already double-checking the radio as if he expected to need backup at any second. I felt this nagging urge to go outside again, to scan the perimeter and be absolutely sure we were alone. Yet, the idea of venturing past the door gave me pause. I remembered all the times I'd teased guests about being nervous in the dark, and suddenly I wondered if I'd been a fool to brush off what the woods might conceal. Something about the night put a knot in my chest. I kept seeing movement in the corners of my eyes, just enough to unsettle me. Every time I turned, there was nothing but old walls and dusty corners. Dana cleared her throat and said we should try to keep it together, that sometimes these shifts set our imaginations on overdrive. She kept talking about how the stories of Hollow Grove weren't just for spooking tourists. There was a grain of truth buried in them, enough to make even skeptics look over their shoulders now and then. I wanted to brush it off, but I couldn't. Not with the wind howling outside like it had a purpose. Not with the odd quiet in the station, even though the four of us were there. And definitely not with the sense that something or someone was beyond our beam of light, standing just out of sight, waiting. We didn't speak for a while after that. We just sat there, each lost in our own thoughts, half expecting a knock on the door or a flicker of movement in the dark. When we finally did say anything, it was barely above a whisper, as if we were afraid of who else might be listening. Dana had a faraway look that practically begged us to lean in. I could see she wasn't sure if she really wanted to rehash whatever was sitting on her mind, but she let out a shaky sigh and began. "A couple years back," she said quietly, "I was finishing up a shift here. The weather had been horrible for days. Relentless rain, all the trails basically sludge. Nobody was bothering to visit, which meant I had to keep an eye out by myself. That night, I was still new enough to think every single bump outside could be a stray animal. Except, the sounds I heard weren't from an animal." She paused, gazing at the table. None of us moved. Even Pat, who usually tries to crack a joke and break tension, just watched her in silence. Dana went on about how she'd spent the whole evening hauling fallen branches off the paths. When the sun set, she ducked inside, thinking she'd wait out the storm and call it a night. The wind was raging so hard the station windows rattled every few seconds. Finally, her stomach growled, so she ordered from the nearest diner. Old Henry, a delivery guy everyone in town knew, pulled up half an hour later. She stepped out onto the porch to grab her food. "I remember how dark it felt," she said, rubbing her hands together like she could still feel the chill. There was this dampness that wouldn't let go. The diner headlights cut across the station's walls, but everything else was swallowed by black sky. She tried to keep it casual, chatting with Henry about the rain, about how he managed to drive in such miserable conditions. But he kept glancing over her shoulder. Finally, he blurted out that somebody was standing among the twisted oaks near the fence. Dana saw nothing at first, just the silhouette of trees shifting in the wind. Then she made out a shape, thin, ragged, like it was half crouched behind a trunk. That's when they both heard it, something like a hushed voice telling them to go. "It didn't feel like a threat," Dana admitted, tapping her fingers on the table. "It was more like someone warning us." But I couldn't begin to guess who or what was trying to help. The fear ramped up quick. She and Henry jumped into his car without saying a word, not caring about anything but getting down that mud-slick road. The tires spun, kicking up gravel and water, and they raced off. A couple miles later, Henry pulled over, and they just sat there, shaking from adrenaline. Neither one could fully believe what they'd seen. Dana spent the next minutes debating how to explain taking off mid-shift, but it turned out she didn't have to. By that time, she said, the station security system had already caught a group dressed in dark, hooded coats, smashing the door in. They roamed inside for about 5 minutes, rummaging around with this eerie calm. They didn't steal a thing. It was more like they were inspecting the place, searching for something. Then, they walked out into the storm like none of it mattered, leaving behind a few soaked footprints and a lot of unanswered questions. The cops called me in, Dana said, lowering her voice, and all they could figure was a botched robbery. But who breaks down a door just to poke around? They never left a single fingerprint. We all glanced around, half expecting to see those hooded figures lurking right outside our windows. Dana's story was unnerving enough, but she wasn't done. She mentioned the little wooden bundle she discovered later, lying in the corner near the supply closet. A pile of twigs bound with a strip of ribbon so tightly knotted that she had to use a knife to cut it. No one in the department could explain it, and eventually, someone just tossed it in a box to be forgotten. That was the same day the break-in happened, she said. So call me paranoid if you want, but I've spent every day since wondering why those people came in and who they really were. Maybe it has something to do with all the old stories about this place, or maybe we just got unlucky. But either way, I still can't shake the feeling it's not over. She finished talking, and the low hum of our electrical devices was the only noise left. I was imagining Henry's headlights reflecting on a figure half hidden by trunk and branch, waving them away like it was granting mercy. Dana blinked a few times as if waking from a bad dream, and that's when I realized her story had changed the air in the room. We weren't just rangers killing time on another routine shift. We were 4 uneasy souls perched in a remote station with something out there in the darkness, a presence that might help us or harm us, and we had no way of knowing which. We all fell silent after Dana finished her story, like we were waiting for the shadows outside to respond. Pat broke the tension first, clearing his throat and suggesting a perimeter check. It should have been routine, but every step felt heavy. I volunteered to team up with Dana while Pat and Marcus swept the back. Outside, the air was colder than before. The station's floodlight didn't reach far, so most of the yard was barely visible. I noticed how the wind had died down. It made every noise echo like the forest was an empty stage waiting for an actor to appear. Dana and I started circling around the side, flashlights bouncing off twisted branches and soggy undergrowth. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself we were just being thorough. Yet it felt like we were trespassing on something's territory. A few yards from the storage shed, our beams picked up footprints, barefoot, pressed into the mud. They veered in a weird, meandering path toward the tree line. I glanced at Dana, who knelt and prodded one of the prints with her finger. They were fresh enough to still glisten with moisture. Goosebumps prickled along my arms. Nobody sane would walk around barefoot at this hour. Suddenly, a branch snapped in the distance, louder than it should have been. My flashlight swung toward the tree line, finding nothing but dark shapes. Then I spotted a tiny wooden figure perched on a fallen log, a crude stick person tied with a thread the color of dried blood. For a moment, I could have sworn it tilted its head at me. I knew that was impossible, but it felt real. Dana approached slowly, her steps careful. She reached out and lifted the figure up close. It was damp and smelled faintly of rotting leaves, some kind of totem or warning. We heard murmurs then, hushed voices carrying through the quiet of the night. I flicked off my flashlight, signaling Dana to do the same. Through the gloom, we made out movement. Silhouettes shifting among the trees, maybe 4 or 5. They moved in a rhythmic way, as if following a practiced formation. No flashlights, no phones, just bodies and shadows. We crouched, our hearts pounding, thoughts racing about what we'd do if they headed our way. Pat and Marcus stumbled upon us, nearly causing me to jump. Marcus mouthed, "We saw them too," pointing toward another patch of darkness. We decided in silent agreement to back up to the station. As we retreated, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced we were being watched. But I caught only faint outlines flickering through the trees. Inside, we locked the doors, drew the blinds, and shoved a heavy table against the main entrance. The logs in the fireplace popped, scattering embers in a sudden burst. Usually that sound is comforting, but this time it felt more like a warning shot. No one sat. We hovered near the windows, peeking out through narrow gaps in the blinds. The station smelled of damp clothes and fear, if fear can have a smell. Pat wanted to call for backup, but Dana hesitated. What if they're gone by the time anyone arrives? We'll look paranoid. She had a point. I remembered the story she told us, the unanswered questions left behind after the hooded group trashed the station. If they were the same ones prowling outside, they'd likely vanish as soon as they heard sirens. Time dragged. The wind picked up again, rattling the siding. My eyes burned from staring out the window, half expecting to see faces pressed against the glass. The phone lines were spotty this far out. If the lines went down, we'd be stranded without any communication. Marcus joked about how we should have transferred to a beach post, but the humor fell flat. We all knew we were in over our heads. Hours later, the forest remained silent, like it was holding its breath for something worse. We agreed to wait for first light before making any bold moves. Whatever lurked outside, it felt like it was waiting too. The four of us ended up around the fireplace, jumpy at every twig snap or gust of wind. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew the night wasn't done testing us. As the clock inched closer to dawn, we heard the faintest scrape against the back wall, like someone running a blade or a rock along the wood. I stood, flashlight trembling in my hand. But the noise stopped. No footsteps, no break-in. Just a reminder, they were still out there. We realized morning might not bring any safety at all. But for now, it was the only hope we had. We took turns peering through the windows, watching for shapes among the trees, each minute feeling like an hour. There was a shared, unspoken sense that whatever happened tonight was just the prelude. And as we huddled by the sputtering fire, none of us felt particularly eager to see what came next. I made my decision before sunrise. We all did. By the time the gray light started filtering through the station's grim, smeared windows, our nerves were shredded. Every noise from the night before still seemed to echo in the back of my mind. The shifting silhouettes, those footprints in the mud, that faint scrape against the wall. None of us had slept. We were running on pure adrenaline and dread. Pat asked if anyone wanted breakfast, trying to mask the tension with a sliver of normalcy. But no one had much appetite. Marcus simply shook his head, staring at the barrier we'd set against the door. Dana, who had always been our rock, looked like a stranger. Her eyes were dark, hollow circles. She forced a small smile, but didn't say anything. I realized we'd each reached the end of our tether. We peeled back the blinds to watch the first rays of morning cut through the forest, turning the nearest treetops into dull silhouettes. Though the night had receded, it hadn't taken that malevolent feeling with it. I still sensed we were being watched. Maybe from the shadows. Maybe from beyond the battered fence line. That unshakable dread was enough to convince me I couldn't keep doing this. Marcus packed his gear in a frantic, clumsy way, almost as if he thought we needed to evacuate immediately. I couldn't blame him. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing it with whatever personal items I could find, spare clothes, an old mug, a few dog-eared field guides. None of us spoke more than a few words, but there was a shared understanding. We were done. For good. It was like the forest itself had finally broken our last bit of resolve. Pat tore down the makeshift barricade, tossing the table aside with a grunt. "I'm not sticking around," he mumbled, blinking away the fatigue that clung to all of us. "I'll do the paperwork, whatever it takes, but I'm not coming back here." Dana stayed silent, but her eyes darted around the station one final time, almost as if she was memorizing every crack and splinter. I could only imagine what she was feeling, given her past run-ins with whatever lurked out there. Then she swallowed hard and whispered, "Let's go." We stepped outside, the morning air chilling our lungs. Instead of the usual dawn chorus of birds, there was near complete silence. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting to see if we'd actually leave. A low haze lingered around the tree roots, and the wind hissed through damp leaves. That creeping unease wouldn't let up. I felt like eyes were drilling holes in the back of my head. At the trucks, we didn't even try to pretend we'd come back. Normally, there'd be talk of the next shift or a reminder to lock up carefully. This time, we just piled in, turned the keys, and drove away. No glances in the rearview mirror. We knew what we were leaving behind. It wasn't just the station. It was the memory of that horrific night. The footprints in the mud, the indecipherable murmurs among the trees, and the strange totems that hinted we were in over our heads. As we hit the main road, I felt a glimmer of relief mixed with guilt. Part of me worried about the next person who'd fill our roles, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The forest had become too loaded with shadows and unanswered questions. We pulled up to the Central Ranger office later that morning. The woman at the front desk looked startled as we handed over our resignations in near unison. Pat's words tumbled out, shaky but resolute. "We're done. No more nights out there. No more of whatever's in those woods." Nobody asked a single follow-up question. Maybe they'd heard rumors. Maybe they saw our pale faces and realized we'd seen enough. All I know is we gathered our belongings from our lockers without a glance back. I heard Dana quietly mutter that if anyone tried to make her go back, she'd drive 3 states away before she set foot in another forest. Marcus just nodded and patted her shoulder. We left that day, each in our own car, driving away from the Ranger Service and the job we'd once loved. Even though I was relieved, there was a tiny voice in my head warning me. Those woods wouldn't forget us. Sometimes, when I'm alone and thinking too much, I picture the bare footprints and those hooded shapes slipping back beneath the branches. There's a sense of finality to it, but also a lingering question mark. Did we escape or just postpone the inevitable? Either way, I've got no intention of going back to find out. And if anyone were to ask, I'd tell them the same thing. Some places aren't meant to be understood or conquered. Some forests can keep their secrets. And I'll keep my distance forever. Between February of 1983 and November of 1985, I was employed by the United States Forest Service. Back then, the Forest Service ran a kind of earn-as-you-learn program, where you could spend a couple of years as a paid intern, learn the ropes, and then graduate as a fully fledged forest ranger, if you proved yourself capable. I signed up, was selected for induction, and then was sent up to the Woot National Forest as a trainee ranger. I spent the next 6 months realizing I was just about born for that kind of work. I'm not saying it couldn't be hard. It was exhausting at times. But the sense of duty, the feeling that you were doing something good and honorable, was more valuable to me than any paycheck. Those first 6 months were some of the happiest of my life. And at the time, I could see myself walking trails and working on restoration projects for the rest of my career. But then, toward the end of '83, I was offered a very different kind of assignment. Having proven myself capable of working unsupervised and having already confessed to enjoying all the solitude the job had to offer, my district ranger, basically the area chief, asked if I wanted to spend the summer of '84 working as a seasonal fire lookout over on Waldo Mountain. Waldo Mountain is around 50 miles east of Eugene, Oregon, and it overlooks Waldo Lake as well as the Waldo Wilderness area to its north. The lookout is no longer functioning as such today and operates as a kind of public shelter on a first-come, first-served basis. But back then, it was a fully stocked, live-in fire lookout that was occupied by either a forest ranger or a trained volunteer all summer long. The usual arrangement was that 3 different rangers would each do a month-long stretch up at the lookout. But when it came to delegating fire lookout duties for the following summer, staffing problems meant that there were only me and 1 other member of the park staff available for the job. If I did a 6-week-long stretch up in the lookout from early June until mid-July, my district ranger would make sure it reflected very favorably on me when it came to offering me a full-time position. And so, about 6 months after the offer, I was headed out to Waldo Mountain with my first 2 weeks' worth of supplies. Now, a lot of you might be picturing the Waldo Mountain Lookout as being your typical sort of tower and cabin structure. And that's exactly what I was picturing too, before I actually saw the thing. But when I got there, I found it was basically just a small cabin built atop a rocky outcrop. As you can imagine, being so high up on top of a mountain, the views from inside the lookout were nothing short of spectacular. But boy, was it cramped in there. It was maybe 12 by 12 feet, with a cooking and sleeping area crammed into one corner, a small map table in the center, and some cabinets and the ham radio tucked into another. That was to be my home for the next 6 weeks. And I'd be lying if I said that I didn't find the prospect just a little daunting once I was actually faced with it. I thought being alone up there would be easy. The only thing I didn't really consider was the sense of boredom that would set in once my regular duties were out of the way. Being a fire lookout isn't just sitting around waiting for a fire. Since weather conditions hugely influence wildfire behavior, lookouts monitor things like temperature, humidity, and wind speed in order to assess danger levels and potentially even predict a fire's source and behavior based on those observations. This can actually take up a surprising amount of time. Outside of that, lookouts are entirely responsible for maintaining and repairing their shelter and equipment, which, again, can swallow up a surprising amount of time once you realize the summer rains can make your lookout leak like a sieve. But once all those observation and maintenance tasks were over and done with, life up on Waldo Mountain was actually kind of boring. I started out by hiking up and down the ridge to get a really good look at the area. Sometimes I'd head down to one of the lakes nearby to take a bath. I also planned to make the 2 books I brought with me last the whole 6 weeks. But I finished The Sicilian by Mario Puzo in about a week and discovered I could only read The Hunt for Red October for about an hour at a time before all the technical stuff made my head hurt. So then, one day, with nothing else to do but twiddle my thumbs, I decided to familiarize myself with the ham radio. I'd been left instructions on how to use it, as well as what frequencies to dial into if I ever needed to get in touch with anyone. But I figured that instead of trying to learn on the fly while panicking after spotting a forest fire, I should probably mess around with it a little, if only to test if it was properly functioning. I'd been told that I needed to do weekly radio tests anyway, but all that involved was squeezing the little receiver, saying, radio check, over, and then waiting for a response. But then, I wanted to see if the rumors were true, that on a good day, I'd be able to use that little old ham radio to talk to folks as far away as Hawaii. So, like I said, one day I just sat down at the little desk it was mounted on and decided to start playing around with it. You have to remember, this was way before cell phones were as common as they are today. Back in the early 80s, things like ham radios were a much more popular form of long-range communication, especially among a small band of dedicated hobbyists. That being the case, I figured there was a pretty good chance of me finding a voice among the static. I didn't even really plan on talking at first. I was simply content to find an active frequency and listen in on whatever was being said. But then, since I didn't hear anything, I decided to start talking. I remember cycling through the frequencies, listening first, and then repeating something along the lines of, "This is Waldo Mountain Fire Lookout calling. Do you read me? Over." I'd talk, wait about 10 to 15 seconds for a response, then, when I didn't get one, move on to the next. I did this maybe 20 or 30 times, just out of pure boredom, really, when on one particular frequency around the 14 megahertz high frequency mark, I suddenly heard a man's voice come back at me through the buzz of white noise. "Waldo Mountain, this is Pelican Butte Fire Lookout," I heard the voice say. "Receiving you loud and clear. How copy? Over." I didn't really know how to talk over radio. I was just told to say over when I was done speaking, and over and out when I was finished talking altogether. So in reply, I just tried to wing it as best I could. Copy loud and clear, Pelican Butte. Good to hear you. Then I asked exactly where they were located. The guy said he was down near Klamath, almost 80 miles south, and not too far from Mount McLaughlin and the California state line. I guess that's not all that far for a ham radio on a good day. But I was still impressed at how clear it sounded, despite the guy being almost 100 miles away. I was also rather pleased to have someone to talk to. I know I talked about how content I was with my own company, but after going 2 weeks with only one solitary face-to-face encounter with another human being, I was surprised at how much I appreciated hearing another person's voice. The guy said his name was Jim, and that he was a forest ranger with the team down in... It was his 5th season in a row acting as a live-in fire lookout. He sounded very experienced and gave me lots of advice, the most appreciated being his tips on how to keep cabin fever at bay. For those unfamiliar with the term, cabin fever is when people start to feel restless or irritable because they've been indoors or in the same place for too long. Some folks say it can drive you crazy, and although there's no real danger of that up in a fire lookout, that sense of being trapped with your own thoughts can wear on even the strongest of people. I jokingly asked Jim if he ever knew any lookouts who went crazy, either from the isolation or just being stuck in one place for all that time. He reassured me by saying no, he'd never known anyone to lose their mind or anything. He'd known plenty who quit, especially the civilian volunteers that were drafted whenever staffing levels weren't ideal, but he'd never known anyone to go crazy. Then Jim did mention how he thought I was very brave for taking the Waldo Mountain Lookout this season, especially in light of what happened to the last volunteer. Obviously, those are just about the most ominous words a person in my position could ever wish to hear, so right away I asked Jim what he was talking about. He gave me this almost theatrical kind of, "Oh, you didn't know?" and then started saying how he didn't think he should be the one to tell me. But luckily, it only took a little polite cajoling to get him to spill the story. As a matter of fact, I never actually asked what happened to the previous year's lookout. I just took it for granted that a ranger or volunteer had completed the season without any sort of incident. It didn't even occur to me to ask about previous lookouts or their experiences. I just blindly accepted the position, thinking it'd be a paid camping vacation. There was obviously the slight danger of animal attacks if you strayed too far from the lookout, and I had heard rumors of a tower up in Washington getting struck by lightning. But aside from that, what else was there to go wrong up here? Well, Jim was nice enough to fill me in. The last Waldo Mountain Fire Lookout, who had volunteered the previous year, had vanished during the final few weeks of their assignment. One day, a ranger went up to the lookout with some pallets of canned food and water, only to find the place completely deserted. They looked around a little, thinking the volunteer lookout was off taking a wash or something of that nature, and then decided to wait for them. An hour or so passed, so instead of waiting any further, the ranger headed back to HQ and figured they'd check in via radio to make sure the volunteer was doing okay. 24 hours passed, and no one had heard a single thing from the volunteer lookout. So another ranger headed up Waldo Mountain to check on them, only to find the place still deserted. The ranger team figured the volunteer had simply had enough and called it quits. But if that was the case, why was all their stuff still up in the lookout? All their clothes and their food were still there. Hell, even their boots were just lying inside the door, meaning that wherever they went, they did so in bare feet, or maybe sandals. Jim said he and the team down in Klamath followed the volunteers' disappearance as best they could. Losing a lookout like that felt personal, and Jim said the Klamath team even sent a few rangers up to Wamut to help with the search and rescue effort. But the volunteer was never found, and as far as Jim knew, they were still officially a missing person. I asked him what he thought had happened to the missing volunteer, and he said it was difficult to say. It wasn't out of the question that they'd taken a nasty fall someplace, maybe even down a ravine or into a hidden cave system, which might explain why they were never found. But then again, Jim said that you also couldn't rule out some kind of foul play. Maybe it was a personal thing. The volunteer had an enemy, someone they'd made very angry, who was devious enough to realize that hitting them someplace secluded like that might make for the perfect murder. Or maybe, just maybe, this poor soul got themselves selected almost at random by a killer who saw an opportunity and just took it. I remember listening to all of that and feeling the hairs on my arms and neck stand on end. Jim said he didn't mean to scare me and offered up a final theory involving the volunteer just voluntarily leaving, having gotten sick and tired of the lookout lifestyle to the point that they couldn't even bring themselves to carry their stuff home. You did indeed get the occasional rich kid heading up there to find themselves or something for those 3 months, only to realize they were wasting their entire summer vacation by week 2 or 3. So, if he had to put his money where his mouth was, Jim said he'd have gone with that. Granted, that final theory was probably the most likely outcome. But I'm also not scared to admit that the stuff he'd said first had me pretty shaken up. I kept a .38 with me just in case I ran into an overly friendly mountain lion, and that would obviously work at keeping a person at bay too. But the idea of someone creeping up on the lookout in the middle of the night while I was fast asleep, that was most definitely enough to give me the heebie-jeebies. I thanked Jim for passing on the info. Then, at the next available opportunity, I asked one of the WT Rangers about the missing volunteer from the previous year. They said they had no idea what I was talking about, that the ranger who had served as lookout the previous summer was one of the same ones who couldn't do it this year. I'd actually worked with this ranger on several different occasions, so I knew from personal experience that they hadn't gone missing, or that if they had, they sure had turned up again. I mentioned this to Jim the next time I got in touch with him, and he basically gave it the old, "Oh, that's what they told you, is it?" And I suppose they had folks just jumping at the chance to serve as lookouts this year, huh? Hearing him say that prompted a moment of terrified realization, so much so that I literally felt the color draining from my face as I listened. It was possible that Jim knew the WT Ranger had trouble finding lookouts for that season, so much so that I'd been asked to complete an extended stay. But even if he didn't know and it was just pure guesswork on his part, he was right. Once again, I got in touch with WUTHQ using my ham radio and asked them if the whole missing volunteer thing was true. My district ranger denied the whole thing and told me that I must have been getting some bad info from someplace. He said that he'd never heard of any Jim down there and that he'd be in touch with Clamo's district ranger all the same. He claimed that it wasn't very professional for one of the rangers to be spreading rumors like that, and that I was to disregard anything I'd been told. Now, I know I should have just listened to my superiors at WUT, but you also need to appreciate the unusual position I was in back then. There just wasn't any Google or smartphones to fact-check things at the drop of a hat. All I had with me was my radio, and I couldn't simply abandon my post to go off investigating all the stuff I'd been told. The only thing I really had to go on was this. Unlike other years when the Rangers were inundated with hundreds of volunteer lookout applications, it had been almost impossible to properly staff the lookout for the '85 season. That's the thing that played on my mind until, in the end, I had no idea who to believe. As crazy as this might sound, I chose not to confront Jim regarding what he told me about the missing volunteer. In my head, I rationalized it by telling myself how Jim might have been mistaken somehow. Maybe he was confusing Waldo Mountain with another Oregon lookout, or maybe even one up in Washington. He might have also gotten mixed up regarding what year this person went missing. Either way, I didn't want to alienate the only other person I could talk to for prolonged periods, someone who knew what it was like living at a fire lookout. Anyway, about a week later, Jim and I were talking one evening when he asked if Waldo Mountain was anywhere near Deschutes County. I had to check my map table, but lo and behold, W.T. National Forest was right on the border of Deschutes County. Jim went on to tell me that he had an old high school buddy who lived out near a place called Lapine, which, when I checked, was only around 25 miles from Waldo Mountain. Jim's high school buddy had checked in to say hi, but also to tell him a troubling story about a break-in that had occurred in his neighborhood just the previous night. Someone had broken into a family home completely silently, then crept up the stairs. But instead of robbing or hurting anyone, the intruder crept into the husband and wife's bedroom and just watched them sleep. The wife said she woke up, saw some shadowy figure looming over her, and screamed. Her scream woke up her husband, which prompted the intruder to hightail it out of there. No one was hurt, but the whole neighborhood was spooked. After the news hit the airwaves, the whole of Lapine and Deschutes County seemed to be on edge. I didn't need to ask why Jim told me all of that, and as I listened, I felt this icy chill run through me. I knew I was 25 miles away from where the break-in had happened, but I couldn't help but picture the intruder creeping up to my lookout before watching me sleep. I had my .38 with me, which made me feel a lot safer. But all the way out there, miles away from just about anything, no one would come running at the sound of my screams, because there would be no one there to hear them. I think Jim could tell how spooked I was because good old Jim seemed quick to reassure me. He didn't think I was in any real danger, but in light of the incident's proximity to Waldo Mountain, as well as what had supposedly happened there a year before, he figured it was worth giving me the heads up just in case. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the radio dialed into Jim's frequency, and he did the same with me. He checked in once or twice just to make sure that I was all right, and each time I only had good news to share. But on more than one occasion, I heard something from outside the lookout that had me clutching that .38, shining my flashlight through the dirty glass windows, and praying that I wouldn't see anyone approaching through the darkness. Thankfully, I never did. I heard a bunch of things that scared me just about out of my wits, but never anything that I felt might threaten my life. That same fear wasn't quite as strong the next night, and Jim reassured me that there hadn't been any more of those creepy break-ins over in Lapine. But still, it weighed on my mind for quite a few nights after, and I don't think I got more than 3 or 4 hours of solid sleep during each one. Then came the day when I finally got to talk to my district ranger over the ham radio and got the opportunity to ask him some follow-up questions regarding that missing volunteer from the year before. My district ranger, who had been in touch with the folks down in Clamo, said that there had been no record of anyone named Jim staffing any of their lookouts. This wasn't something that I could let go of, though, so I confronted Jim on it, and this is what he told me. He swore on his grandchildren's lives that he really was in an old fire lookout tower down in Clamo County. It just wasn't in service anymore, and neither was he. Jim told me that he'd spent 30 years in the Forest Service, and for his final 5, he had indeed spent every summer up in a fire lookout. Now, he was retired, but since his wife had passed, he found that he missed being out in nature during those long Oregon summers. With his old lookout being permanently freed up, he decided to head out there, fix it up a little, and then spend the summer steeped in nostalgia. Jim figured that he'd come off as some lonely old coot if he told me the truth. So instead, he told me a little white lie, never imagining that he'd eventually be found out. He swore that everything else he told me was the truth, especially all the stuff about the volunteer going missing. And truthfully, I believed him. It made perfect sense to me, as much as I needed it to, anyway. I just didn't want to lose that voice in the static, the one I was counting on more and more to keep me sane. The first few weeks had been a breeze, and although the addition of Jim had been welcome, it had not been entirely necessary. But then, toward my final week, week 6, I realized that I had just about reached the limits of my endurance for isolation. and I had actually started to consider Jim a good friend. With that in mind, you can imagine the fear that I felt one night when Jim got in touch over the radio with a distinct sound of terror in his voice. As I said, we had been keeping our radios tuned to one another's frequencies at night, just in case anything bad happened. It had been a quiet evening, but then at around midnight, my radio suddenly burst to life with the sound of Jim's voice. "Jake, it's Jim," he said in a slow, shaky voice before asking, "Are you there? How copy? Over." Hearing the urgency in his voice, I rushed over to the radio and began asking him what was up. He then told me, in this frantic, fractured style of speech, that he'd heard someone moving around in the darkness outside his lookout tower. Then, after grabbing his flashlight and heading out onto the walkway outside his cabin, he realized that there were several dark figures in the woods surrounding him on 3 sides. Right away, I told Jim to get the hell off the frequency so he could call for help. But Jim then told me that he'd already tried to contact his HQ down in Clamo, but no one seemed to be manning the radio. He needed me to contact my Ranger HQ so that they could call the cops down in Clamo. I told him I'd do that right away, but before I could twist the frequency dial, I heard him shouting, "Wait!" Jim then started to explain, in the same terrified voice, that the cops needed to know which Pelican Butte to drive out to. Apparently, there was already a Pelican Butte campground down in Clamo County, and the cops needed to head to the old lookout tower Jim was manning, which was off Falls Highway near the 4M Flat Quarry. If I didn't pass along this crucial piece of information, Jim would be screwed. I remember frantically scribbling all that information down and asking Jim to repeat the name of the forest road he had mentioned at one point. And then, after waiting for his response, this is what I heard. Jim's voice suddenly broke through the static and said, "Oh God, they're coming up the stairs." I told him to lock and load the rifle he'd mentioned having with him and to shoot anyone who came through the door to his cabin. I then heard Jim screaming, "Oh my God, oh my God! What the hell are you people?" And the next thing I heard was a loud bang, then another and another. Jim let out a scream, and then, once his own had sort of petered out, something else unleashed an ear-splitting, inhuman roar before the transmission suddenly went quiet. I've faced some pretty terrifying moments in my life, but that right there might just take the cake. I thought I had just heard Jim, a man I'd grown remarkably close to over the previous 5 weeks, being shot to death in a lookout tower almost 100 miles from where I was sitting. I flew into a full-blown panic, trying desperately to dial into the frequency of the WUTHQ. Once I had one of the Rangers on the other end, I began to frantically relay everything I'd heard, including all the details about going to the correct location. Then, once they had promised to contact the Clamo County Sheriff, I switched back to Jim's frequency and began calling out to him across the airwaves. "Jim," I said. "Jim, are you there, buddy?" And the airwaves stayed silent. Nothing but the cold buzz of static. I begged him to say something, say anything. I told him the cops were on their way, that he just needed to hang on and everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew things most probably were not. Jim had mentioned spotting several people circling his tower in the woods below him, which meant the odds were not in his favor. So when he set the radio's handset down, it hit me that the man I'd gotten to know so well over the previous 5 weeks had just been brutally murdered before my very ears. But then, just as my head sank down in my hands, the radio buzzed to life and someone began to speak. "Hello?" someone asked. The voice sounded like it belonged to a younger man. "Is anyone there?" I rushed over to the radio, announced my presence, and then asked where Jim was and if he was okay. In reply, and in a way that I could almost hear him grinning, he told me, "Sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Jim is dead." I heard laughter before the transmission cut out. In response, I started yelling about how they wouldn't get away with what they had just done. I told them the authorities were already on their way, that they were all going to rot in jail. But when I figured whoever was on the other end probably wasn't listening anymore, I ceased my rant and let go of the push-to-talk button. only to hear laughter coming from the other end. It was maniacal, gloating, satisfied. Just as I was leaning forward to change the frequency and rid myself of the taunting howls of a murderous stranger, they spoke once more. "You're so stupid," I heard them laughing. "I can't believe you sent the cops out there." The voice had changed almost completely, but in my confusion, I didn't quite realize what was going on yet. I reached over, picked up the handset, and once again asked where Jim was. "There is no Jim, you moron," I heard in reply. "It was me this whole time, and you ate it up. What kind of sad, lonely piece of human trash are you? You ate up every word." I was speechless, stunned into a dumb silence, and all I could do was listen. "Goddamn," the young man said. "I knew I was good, but I didn't think I was that good." He let out another long, wheezing laugh. Then, once he pulled himself together a little, he asked if I was still there. I didn't know what else to say. I picked up the handset, and the first thing that came to mind was the first thing out of my mouth. "You should be ashamed of yourself," I said. "And you should off yourself," came the reply instantly, with the man screaming those last two words so loud they were almost lost in distortion. As I leaned over to the radio set to change the frequency, more of that same warped, maniacal laughter poured out from the small tinny speakers, only to be suddenly silenced with the twist of the dial. To say I felt foolish would be the understatement of the century. That guy dangled a little bait in the water, and not only did I bite, but I swallowed it hook, line, and sinker too. There was no Jim. There was no missing volunteer lookout from the year before. But then again, I bet some of you figured that one out a long way back. I also bet that guy knew so much about being a fire lookout because he'd talked to one a whole bunch, most likely using the same ham radio he used to talk to me. Then, I don't know, maybe what was intended as a one-time prank just snowballed. It wouldn't be too hard to fake all those sounds either. The gunshots and the screams, I mean. But what must have been difficult for anyone in their right mind was having the patience to drag me through a 5-week-long con before delivering that horrifying final performance. That's what, for me at least, makes this all seem like a lot more than just a playful prank. He didn't just string me along for a day or two, call me a sucker, and then disappear from the airwaves to waste some other radio operator's time. He kept things going for more than a month. He put hours into talking to me, into building his character and earning my trust. He put on the gravelly smoker's voice of a man in his 60s, and he did so for hours upon hours upon hours. Then, in the end, the kid, I guess, who ended up screaming at me through the airwaves sounded like his balls had only just dropped. He made me believe in a person who didn't exist, and as much as that speaks to the sheer magnitude of my own idiocy, I think it says a lot about his being a psycho too. I spent the rest of my final week in a kind of semi-depressed daze. I felt like the single stupidest person on the face of the earth, a weak-minded, pathetic excuse for a man who got so lonely that he fell for the dumb prank of a bored, psychopathic teenager. And that's the thing too. I didn't just fall for it one time. I fell for it again and again and again. Every time I picked up that handset and started talking to Jim, I let that black-hearted little brat take me for a ride all over again. I'd been humiliated, stripped of any and all pride, and when the time came to leave the lookout, I was only too happy to put the whole thing behind me. The sun was just starting to dip behind the mountains when the call came through. It was the kind of light that turned the trees into long, jagged shadows, casting an orange hue over everything, making the forest look both beautiful and a little sinister at the same time. I was standing on the porch of the ranger station, my back sore from another day in the field, thinking about nothing in particular. Then the radio crackled to life. "Ian, you there?" It was Kyle, the new guy. Fresh as they come, but eager. He was stationed up near the old Firewatch Tower, abandoned for years now since the budget cuts. I raised the radio to my mouth. "Go ahead, Kyle." There was a pause, too long. A crackle of static filled the silence, and then I heard it, the sound of his breathing. Fast and uneven. Fear. I think something's out here, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. What are you talking about? I asked, a knot of unease forming in my gut. Is it a bear? No, not a bear. Something else. Something's not right. The knot tightened. Stay calm, Kyle. Where are you exactly? By the watchtower near the North Ridge. I thought I saw something in the trees. The radio cut out, and what came next made my blood run cold. A sound low and guttural like an animal, but not quite. It was a sound that didn't belong to anything I knew in these woods. The radio crackled once more, a blood-curdling scream. And then, nothing. Silence. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my hand gripping the radio so tight my knuckles were white. The air around me seemed to still, thick with something I couldn't name. I could feel the others inside the station staring at me, waiting. Jess was the first to speak, her voice cutting through the heavy quiet. "What the hell was that?" she asked, stepping outside. Jess was our tracker, a seasoned ranger who could find anything or anyone in these woods. But even she looked rattled. I lowered the radio slowly, my mind already racing. "Kyle's in trouble. He's by the old fire watchtower. We need to go, now." James, the biologist, came to the door next. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, that permanent skeptical expression on his face. "You really think it's something dangerous? Could be just a mountain lion, maybe even a wolf. Nothing to panic about." But I'd heard panic in Kyle's voice. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a mountain lion. I could feel it in my bones. "I don't know what it is," I admitted, "but we're not leaving him out there alone." I looked to Trevor, the youngest of the group, fresh out of training. His face was pale, and he shifted nervously from foot to foot. He didn't want to go. Hell, I didn't want to go either. But leaving Kyle out there? Not an option. "We leave in 5, I said, already moving to grab my gear. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my face calm. We had a job to do, and if I let fear get the better of me, we'd all be in trouble. As we headed out, the sky darkened into twilight, the forest around us sinking into that thick, oppressive silence. It wasn't normal. Even the birds had gone quiet. We moved quickly, the crunch of leaves under our boots the only sound. But something felt off. The usual life of the woods was absent. No rustling in the underbrush, no distant howls, just nothing. Jess walked ahead, her eyes scanning the ground, tracking Kyle's path. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was on edge, her movements a little too tense. James kept muttering under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. And Trevor stayed close, his head on a constant swivel, wide-eyed like a deer caught in headlights. As we approached the old fire watchtower, I noticed the way the trees seemed to close in around us, casting long, crooked shadows that made it feel like we were being watched. The tower stood like a ghost against the sky, a dark silhouette looming over the forest. And then I saw it, Kyle's pack lying at the base of the tower, but no sign of Kyle. My heart sank. Something wasn't right. I knelt next to the pack, scanning the area for any sign of a struggle. Nothing. The air was heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't explain. I looked up at the watchtower. Its rusted frame creaked in the wind, but otherwise it was silent, too silent. "We'll split up," I said, my voice low. "Jess, check the tree line. James, look around the base. Trevor, stay with me." But as the words left my mouth, a new sound cut through the air. A voice, faint but clear. "Ian, help." It was Kyle. But something in the tone wasn't right. The forest had swallowed us whole. The fading light from the sky barely pierced through the thick canopy overhead. It was just shadows now, dark, tangled branches and trunks stretching into the dusk. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, like the woods were holding their breath. Every step felt like an intrusion, like we weren't supposed to be here. We'd been walking for about an hour, but it felt longer. Jess, as usual, was ahead, eyes fixed on the ground, picking up signs that none of the rest of us could see. I kept glancing around, uneasy, the weight of Kyle's last transmission gnawing at me. The guy had been spooked, seriously spooked, and now we were heading straight into whatever had caused it. James, always the skeptic, pushed through the brush behind me, breathing hard. He wasn't exactly built for long treks in the wilderness. "This is getting ridiculous, Ian," he muttered. "You're seriously telling me you believe in this? Whatever it is, Skinwalkers? Supernatural nonsense? You know what's more likely? Kyle got scared by a bear or a wolf and he's hiding somewhere. I didn't answer right away, just kept moving. I wanted to believe that too. But that sound over the radio, whatever it had been, was still in my head, curling around my thoughts like a snake. It wasn't something I'd heard before, and I'd spent my life in these woods. James, I said after a long pause, I don't know what I believe, but something scared him, and we need to find out what. Ahead, Jess had stopped. She was crouched low, studying something on the ground. Trevor and I moved toward her, James huffing as he caught up. What is it? I asked. She pointed silently. There, caught on a low branch, was a strip of fabric, green, like the ranger uniforms we all wore. It was torn, ragged at the edges, and stained with something dark. My stomach twisted. Kyle's? Trevor asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jess nodded, her face grim. She stood, brushing dirt off her knees. His trail goes further into the trees, but I'm not liking what I'm seeing. I knew what she meant. We'd all noticed it. Claw marks, gouged deep into the trunks of the surrounding trees. Whatever had left them was big, too high up to be from a bear, too wide to be a mountain lion. I ran my fingers over one of the marks, trying to picture what kind of creature could have done this. Nothing I could think of matched. What the hell made those? Trevor asked, taking a step back, his eyes darting around, scanning the shadows like something might leap out at us. Nothing good, Jess answered flatly. We need to move, fast. She was right. The woods were starting to feel alive, like something was watching us. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to head back to the ranger station and wait until daylight, but Kyle was still out here, and I couldn't leave him behind. We pushed forward, following Jess as she tracked deeper into the forest. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the usual sounds of the woods, birds, insects, the rustle of animals in the brush, were completely absent. It was like the whole forest had gone still, waiting for something to happen. Look, Jess said quietly, pointing ahead. I followed her gaze and saw it, a cabin, barely visible through the trees. The roof sagged, and the walls were worn, but it was still standing. That's Noah's place, I said. The old man lived way out here, keeping mostly to himself. I hadn't seen him in years. He was a Native American shaman, or so the rumors went. People said he knew things about the forest, things most of us didn't want to know. As we approached, the door creaked open, and Noah stepped out, his weathered face unreadable. He didn't seem surprised to see us. Ian, he greeted me, his voice rough as gravel. You've come looking for your young friend. I nodded. Kyle. He's gone missing near the old fire watchtower. Noah's dark eyes flicked to the others, then back to me. You shouldn't be here? He said simply. I waited, but he didn't elaborate. Frustration bubbled up inside me. What do you mean? You know something, don't you? He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the tree line. There's something old in these woods, something that doesn't belong to this world. It hunts under the moon, takes many shapes. Your young friend? He paused, choosing his words carefully. He's not lost. He's been taken. James scoffed, shaking his head. You can't be serious. But I was serious. Noah's words sent a chill down my spine, like ice water flowing through my veins. Taken by what? The watchtower was built on land that wasn't meant for men, Noah continued, his voice low and heavy with meaning. It's a place of power, but also of danger, and now you're walking right into its grasp. Jess shifted beside me, her jaw tight. We need to find Kyle. Noah met her gaze. If you go further, you'll find more than your friend, and you may not like what you see. I glanced back at the forest. The trees seemed to press closer, the shadows deeper. Something was out there, waiting. The sun disappeared faster than I'd expected, swallowed up by the thick tangle of trees that closed in around us. The darkness didn't creep in. It fell, hard, like a curtain dropping after a show. 1 minute, there was a faint glow in the distance. The next, nothing. Just shadows and the faint rustling of wind through the treetops. But even the wind felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. Jess was the first to suggest we set up camp, but we all knew it was more out of necessity than comfort. Our pace had slowed, tension growing with each step, and we hadn't seen a trace of Kyle for hours. Just his pack, some torn fabric, and those claw marks on the trees. Whatever was out here, it wasn't going to let us find him easily. We cleared a small patch of ground just off the path, far enough from the thickest of the trees, but close enough to feel trapped. I could see it in their faces. Jess, James, Trevor, they were all trying to act like everything was under control, like this was just another night out in the wilderness. But none of us believed it. Fire, Jess said quietly, gathering dry branches. It'll keep the animals away. But we all knew it wasn't animals we were worried about anymore. James didn't say much, which was unusual for him. Normally, he'd be full of explanations, trying to make sense of everything with his wildlife biology degree, dismissing anything he couldn't explain with logic and facts. But not now. The look on his face told me he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Trevor was the worst off. He sat hunched over near the fire, hugging his knees like a scared kid, eyes darting to every rustle, every crack of a twig in the darkness. I could hear his breath quickening, feel the tension rising in him like a coiled spring ready to snap. "We're fine," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. "We've been through worse, right?" But no one answered. The fire flickered weakly, throwing twisted shadows against the trees. The woods seemed to move around us, closing in just out of reach of the light. That oppressive silence, so thick you could feel it pressing down on your chest, lingered. And I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. We sat there, staring into the flames, pretending it was enough to keep the darkness at bay. Then, without warning, a sound cut through the stillness. A voice. "Help, please," Kyle's voice. Trevor shot up from his spot, eyes wide. "Kyle!" he yelled, taking a step toward the trees. "Wait!" I grabbed his arm, yanking him back. He looked at me, confused and desperate, but I kept my grip firm. There was something off about that voice, something not quite right. It was too faint, too distant, like it wasn't coming from anywhere at all, just hanging in the air around us. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone, swallowed up by the woods. "That wasn't him," Jess said softly, eyes scanning the dark tree line. "It sounded like him," Trevor argued, "but it wasn't." He shook his head. "You don't know that. He could be out there, hurt, scared. We can't just leave him." "We're not leaving him," I said. "But running off into the dark isn't going to help either. We stick together. If that was Kyle, we'll find him." I gestured toward the trees. But that didn't feel right. Trevor's resolve cracked. His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. Instead, he just nodded, eyes still darting nervously toward the trees. We all stayed close to the fire after that. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I kept listening for that voice, but it didn't come again. Instead, there were other sounds. Quiet, almost imperceptible at first. A snapping branch, the shuffle of something moving through the underbrush. Jess stiffened beside me, her hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on her belt. Then came the growl. Low, guttural, like something big, something dangerous. Just beyond the circle of firelight. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. James, who had been staring into the flames, looked up, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, eyes wide. We all stood, weapons ready, scanning the darkness. The growl came again. Closer this time. I could feel it reverberate in my chest, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the ground beneath us. My heart pounded, adrenaline flooding my veins. Every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then the growl stopped, replaced by a sickening silence. We waited, tense, expecting something to leap out of the shadows. But instead, it was Trevor who broke the stillness. His voice cracked, barely audible. I turned toward him, just in time to see his wide, terrified eyes, before he disappeared into the darkness. Gone. Just like that. His radio hit the ground with a soft thud, the only thing left of him. Then it crackled to life, and through the static came Trevor's voice. "Help! I'm here." But it wasn't him. The fire watchtower loomed over us like a forgotten monument, barely visible in the gloom. Its rusted frame creaked in the wind, a skeleton of what it once was. We stumbled toward it, driven by pure instinct and fear, Trevor's disappearance still fresh in our minds. The ground felt like it was shifting under my feet, every step heavier than the last, as though the forest itself didn't want us to reach the tower. Jess was limping beside me, her breath ragged and shallow. She had twisted her ankle when we'd run from the campsite after Trevor vanished, but she refused to slow down. I could see the pain etched on her face, but we both knew stopping wasn't an option, not with whatever was out there stalking us. James trailed behind, pale and silent, his disbelief finally shattered by what we'd witnessed. The thing in the forest wasn't an animal. It wasn't something any of us had ever dealt with. I glanced back at him, his eyes wide and wild, like a man on the edge of losing it completely. "You hanging in there, James?" He didn't answer at first, just kept moving, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I don't know what's out there," he muttered. "I thought it was maybe just some predator. But this, it's not." His voice cracked. "It's real," I said grimly, "and it's coming." We reached the base of the tower, and my hand instinctively went to the ladder. I craned my neck, looking up. The old wooden platform was barely visible in the dim light, just a dark outline against the sky. I didn't like the idea of going up there. It felt like a trap. But staying on the ground wasn't an option either. "Up," I said, pushing Jess ahead of me. "Let's move." One by one, we climbed, the old rungs creaking under our weight. My pulse pounded in my ears, my senses screaming at me to keep moving, keep climbing. Behind us, the forest was too quiet. No more growling, no more rustling, just that suffocating silence, like the whole world was holding its breath. We reached the top and clambered onto the platform. It swayed under our weight, groaning in protest, but it held. The view from up here was terrifying. Nothing but blackness in every direction, the forest stretching out like an endless ocean of trees. And yet, I felt exposed. The tower wasn't a sanctuary. It was a perch. And whatever was out there could see us. James crouched by the edge, gripping the railing with white knuckles. "We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have." His voice was barely more than a whisper, panic seeping into every word. "Get a grip, James," I snapped. "We didn't have a choice." Then I saw it. The blood. It was smeared across the floorboards, a dark, dried stain that trailed toward the corner. My stomach lurched as I recognized the mark. Kyle had been here. This was where it had taken him. "Ian," Jess said, her voice low, "we need to keep moving." But before I could respond, there it was again, a voice, faint and distant, floating up from below. "Ian, Jess, help me." "Kyle, not anymore." "Don't listen to it," I said, louder than I meant to. "It's not him." But the voice kept coming. Closer now. Clearer. "Please, Ian, help me." I backed away from the edge, caught, my hand tightening on the grip of the rifle slung across my shoulder. Then, an explosion of sound from below. Branches snapping. Something large crashing through the underbrush. It was circling the tower. Then, silence. James stood suddenly, his face pale as a ghost. I can hear him," he said. I turned and saw them. Two glowing yellow eyes just beyond the tree line. Too high up to belong to anything normal. Too bright. Too wrong. James didn't scream. He didn't make a sound. As something pulled him into the darkness, the sound of snapping branches and tearing flesh filled the night. Jess clutched my arm, her breath ragged. "What do we do?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "We wait." But even as I said it, I knew. There was no waiting. The thing had found us, and now it was just a matter of time. Below us, the voice came again. Soft, pleading. "Ian, please." I closed my eyes, gripping my rifle tighter. It was going to come for us next. The forest was alive with the sound of something hunting us. The skinwalker circled below, unseen but unmistakably there, its movements too fast, too erratic. We could hear it growl, reverberating through the trees, a low guttural sound that sent ice-cold terror through my veins. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me gripping the rifle tighter, but I knew a gun wasn't going to stop whatever was down there. Jess crouched beside me, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her face pale, streaked with sweat and dirt. Neither of us spoke, both listening to the sound of the creature prowling below, waiting for it to make its move. The fire watchtower swayed slightly under the pressure of the wind, or maybe under the pressure of something worse. something that didn't care whether or not we had high ground. "I don't think it's going to stop," Jess whispered, her voice raw, barely a thread of sound. I swallowed hard. "No, it won't. It's playing with us." The creature was relentless. Every few minutes it would let out a sound, sometimes like Kyle's voice, sometimes like a deep, ragged breath, always pulling at our nerves, making it impossible to think straight. The rifle felt useless in my hands. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a wolf. This was something older, darker, and it was feeding off our fear. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed up from below. Something had hit the tower, hard. The whole platform shuddered, sending splinters flying up from the old, rotten wood. I grabbed Jess, pulling her back from the edge just as another thud shook the entire structure. "It's trying to knock the tower down," Jess said, her voice barely above a whisper, eyes wide with panic. "We can't stay up here," I said, scanning the surrounding forest. The trees were just a blur of black shadows, but the sense of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. We were running out of options. If it brought the tower down, we'd be sitting ducks. Another loud crash, and the tower groaned under the force. I felt the platform shift beneath us, my heart racing. If we didn't move, this thing was going to tear the whole place apart. "We've got to make a run for it," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Now, before it brings us down." Jess nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. She gripped her knife tighter, even though we both knew it wouldn't do much against what waited for us in the trees. I threw the rifle over my shoulder, slung low, and moved toward the ladder. "Stay close. We run straight for Noah's cabin. If we can make it to his land, maybe it won't follow." I didn't wait for her to respond. I grabbed the ladder and began my descent, the wood creaking beneath my weight. Every second felt like a lifetime. I kept expecting the skinwalker to grab me, yank me off the ladder, and drag me into the dark, but nothing came. Jess was right behind me, her breathing sharp and fast. As soon as my boots hit the ground, I spun around, scanning the forest. The growling had stopped. The forest was eerily still. Too still. "Let's go," I said, grabbing her arm, and we bolted. The woods closed in around us immediately. The shadows deeper, thicker, like the trees themselves wanted to slow us down. We ran hard, dodging branches, our boots pounding against the uneven ground. I could hear Jess just behind me, her breath ragged and desperate, but we didn't slow down. Behind us, there was a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of something large moving fast through the trees. "It's coming," Jess yelled, her voice trembling with terror. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. The howling started again, low at first, then rising, gaining speed, getting closer. It was right behind us. I could feel it. "Faster," I urged, pushing Jess ahead of me. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest, but we couldn't stop. Not now. The howling turned into a series of distorted, mocking cries, like the skinwalker was shifting voices, trying to confuse us, unsettle us. Sometimes it sounded like Kyle, sometimes like Trevor, sometimes like something far worse. We were running blind, crashing through the underbrush, barely able to see where we were going. The only goal was Noah's cabin. If we could just make it there, maybe the skinwalker would stop. Maybe. "There!" Jess cried out, pointing ahead. Through the darkness, I saw it, a faint light, barely visible through the trees. Noah's cabin. It was so close, but the skinwalker was even closer. The ground beneath us shook with its footsteps now, the heavy thud of claws tearing through the earth. I could hear its breath, ragged and animalistic, and the unnatural growl that sent chills down my neck. We burst through the last line of trees, stumbling into the small clearing that surrounded Noah's cabin. The creature was so close now. I could feel its presence, feel its eyes burning into my back. "Noah!" I screamed, my voice hoarse, desperate. "Noah, help!" Just as we reached the porch, I felt something, hot, wet breath on the back of my neck. The skinwalker was right behind us, but then as soon as my foot hit the first step of the porch, the growling stopped. The air was suddenly still. I collapsed onto the porch, gasping for breath, my heart thudding in my ears. Jess crouched beside me, shaking, her eyes wide with terror. I turned slowly, expecting to see the creature barreling toward us. But there was nothing. The edge of the forest stood silent, dark, as if nothing had been chasing us at all. The door to the cabin creaked open, and Noah stepped out, his eyes calm but heavy with understanding. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. We'd made it. Barely. But the skinwalker, it was still out there, watching us from the trees. And I knew this wasn't over.